Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. In a long list of people I thought would never give me the time of day sits Bruce Voyles. Oddly enough, talking with him a short time resulted in this episode. I don't know why I was so apprehensive, because you can't find a much nicer guy. But this introduction is not about me. Just, it's comforting to know your heroes are not always assholes. Thanks, Bruce. If you know knives today, you probably have seen Bruce's handiwork at play. I think it's important to understand his vast contribution towards the commercialization of knives in America and how he's used publication as his love language for knives. But I just can't. I can't summarize such a complex and genius individual and give him the justice he deserves. I can't quite convey the monumental and rippling contribution he's played in buying and turning Blade magazine into what it is, or Blade Show, or his involvement in the promotion of cutting competitions, or the vast historical and collector markets he's promoted, or the Knife Makers Guild he's supported through times of growth and upheaval, or his auctioning priceless works of art. But thankfully, he can. We have the pleasure of listening to Bruce in this humbling episode of the show, and I feel that way with a great deal of my interviews, that they give me pause, and this is no different. Bruce, it's an honor and a privilege to get to talk to you on the Good Old Blades podcast.
That's good to be here.
Yeah. Man, you are a larger than life character to me. I pretty much every road that I've ever followed down inside of knives has always in some way led back to you. And I'm not trying to blow smoke or anything. This is the reality. And before we started, we were talking about the Wrecking Crew and music, and I think the most influential people oftentimes go unrecognized. And not to say that you're unrecognized in a lot of ways, but under-recognized. If anybody doesn't know how influential you've been in the knife industry by the end of this, this first episode, I think that they will. But that'll be a testament to your articulation and things. So, I mean, first, I come very humbly as a fan of yours, and I think that the very least that I can do is to pay absolute homage to your influence in knives. So I appreciate everything that you've done.
Well, those are very kind words. And as my dad used to say when he was introduced and somebody said, "I've heard a lot about you," the next words out of his, "Well, it's not all true." So he's trying to cover himself. So I don't think I deserve that much. I think the one thing that I guess that I brought to the table is that I like knives, and I've always liked them, and I've just been fascinated with the history and how they're made and how they're constructed, and it's just always been a captivating subject for me. There's an old Gun Digest where Ken Warner was interviewing Bill Ruger, and Bill Ruger said the difference between Ruger and the other gun companies is that they were gun people and they loved guns. They weren't corporate influences just trying to make money. They really liked guns, and he said he thought it showed. And that's what I said for years when we were doing Blade magazine or anything we were doing is we like knives, and I think that shows to a knife collector. Knife collectors have a sense of, you're one of us or you're not one of us. And so for me, it's I just always try to show that because I'm enthused about it and still am. And after, 50 something years doing this, it's still exciting to find a really good knife.
Yeah, I think that's great. Speaking candidly, I want to go back to like the beginning. I've read a lot of articles on you, and especially trying to research to become more competent in some of your back history with knives, in kind of the darker reaches of the web and what's available online. Not just what I have in publication in paper form, but there was an article from 2004 in the Chattanoogan about your life, which is a great read. If anybody hasn't yet, you need to go read it. But it mentions that your uncle had originally talked to you about your golf hobby and everything, and then introduced the concept of knives to you. Is that true?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
can, yeah, can you talk a little bit about like that progression and like how you
Sure.
actually got started in this thing?
Well, sure. Well, my uncle's my uncle's the one that really introduced me to knife collecting per se. But my dad carried a 5391 case Whittler that I distinctly remember. Now, that's a multi-thousand-dollar knife in mint condition. He carried it as pocket knife, and it had one blade broken in it. He carried it. That was the one knife I remember him carrying. Uh, One time they ran a small motel, and he was talking to the guys he was working with because he worked construction full time. And one of the guys had a small case of knives that he was collecting. My dad bought a stag handled case USA 5375 and put it up in the little storage thing above the kitchen table. And he said, keep that because it's collectible. And I think he paid $25 for it at the time. This was like 1968, 69. Knife collecting was just barely getting started. And my great uncle at a reunion once told me that my great grandfather always carried a pocket full of knives and was always trading on knives. And that was on a different side of the family from my uncle. My granddad, when I first learned there was knife collecting, my uncle said, "Look what your granddad's carrying." And he pulled out a 6488 green bone four blade Congress knife. I later sold one of those knives in mint condition for $14,300. And my granddad was carrying something very similar. So evidently, there's something in the blood is part of it. But I went to my uncle. I just married, and I went to my uncle to visit with my grandparents and all that. And I'm with him, my first cousin and I. We went out to the range and we were hitting golf balls, and I was interested in golf at the time. And I came back in, and I just was short on money. And he came in and he uh, said, you and Steve are crazy. I said, what do you mean? He said, your hobby is to go out there and spend money, and you don't have anything to show for it. Come here. And he had a thread cabinet, and he opened up this thread cabinet, and there in neat, equally spaced rows were kissing crane knives and case knives, and they gleamed and they glittered, and they just drew me in. And he said, now all of these were free because I went over to Mitchell Powers Hardware in Bristol, Tennessee, and I bought a half dozen knives at wholesale. And I sold five of those knives. And the profit from those cleared the one here. So I don't have a penny in these knives. And so the next day, he took me to the flea market in Kingsport, Tennessee. And there was a guy set up named Lynn Watkins, who called him Red then. He had red hair. I later asked him when his hair turned gray, were we going to change his name to Gray, but he didn't think that was too funny. And he was there. Joe Wood was there, and several of the old guys. And they had these tables just full of case knives. And I priced some of them, and he was selling them at 40 off retail. And so I spent what money I had with me, and I borrowed money from my uncle to buy a case stag handle canoe for $35. That brings 400 or 500 today. And I was hooked. My wife, my newlywed wife, cried because she thought I had gone insane because I had spent butter and egg money on knives. And I was working at a Tennessee chemical company in Copper Hill, Tennessee, and for the summer job between at college. And I walked in over the next week. I sold all of the knives I had taken except for two, which I put back in a collection. those were free. And I had extra money plus all the money back that I'd taken for the butter and egg money. And she was never really that excited about knives until we went to a show in Sacramento, California. And Jim Parker was there, and Jim always had a small box of diamond rings and cocktail rings and things like that. And she came over and said, "Oh, that's a beautiful ring he had." So I handed her 3 knives, dog's head K-bars, because Jim was collecting dog's head K-bars. So I knew this was his weakness. And I said, "Go over there and see if he'll take 2 of these for that ring." And she came back smiling and said, she said, I just gave him all 3 of them and said, "Take that ring." So she suddenly discovered that knives could be translated into diamonds. And I had a knife collector enthusiast from that point on. So we were, so basically that was my introduction. Is from then on, I was always buying and selling. The interesting thing about Lynn Watkins is he was the first person that sold me knives. He's also the first person that he sold the first knives to Stuart Taylor, who would later buy Schrade and Smith and Wesson and sell them, and did Taylor cutlery. And so he was responsible for introducing, Stuart became a major player in the game, particularly after he purchased Schrade. And Lynn ran Hickory Hills Cutlery and only passed away in the last year or so. Was a super fellow. And he was still coming to our knife shows as late as 3 years ago.
Oh, that's amazing. Do you think that your eye for collecting has been like the larger influence for how you have um, moved and shook the knife industry?
Uh, well, one way I say it allows me to put off that career decision a little bit longer. I like the knives. The fact I can make money on them and make a living out of it has always been something of a surprise. I trained as a journalist, and I've always enjoyed writing. And knives were a subject I enjoyed, so I always wrote about knives. And I've been writing about sporting equipment and things since the 6th grade. The first article I have ever had published in the school paper was how to shoot a 45-70 trapdoor Springfield rifle. And the knife just kind of fell into that too. I'd always wanted to be an outdoor writers association. And I wanted to be an outdoor writer, and I always enjoyed guns. And my plan originally was I was going to uh, get enough knives accumulated where I could start swinging off into buying and selling guns, but I never quite got to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's something that even in the early days of the guild shows and everything like that, it seems like there's been a parallel between guns and knives. Like people pinch hit in either form. But the amount of background you have in knives, I mean, you really dug in like a tick into the knife industry.
Well, it's part of it's primeval. Part of it is the absolute instinct of, the first tool ever was a knife. And I'm sure there were some cavemen that thought that one was chipped obsidian a little bit better than the other one was a little bit more prized. And I think there's an age-old relationship between a man and his tools and a man and his weapons, and that includes firearms, swords, knives, guns, and the whole shooting match. The interesting thing that I discovered early on is, say you have a roll of 60 pocket knives, and you take them to a local cattle sale, and you roll them out on the hood of a car. You will attract a crowd of men. And they're looking, and it's not as if I approve of a knife or not, or knives are such strange things. It's which one of these knives would I like to own? And it's it's just part of being in your psyche is with knives. For me, it was always I don't know. It just seemed to evolve from buying and selling, making money at it. Uh, in 19, I was working at my local paper, my hometown paper, Country Weekly, and I'm buying and trading, collecting knives. The biggest dealer in the business was Jim Parker in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And about 1974, 75, 74, I was going over to Ben Kelly. We lived in Atlanta. I was going to school at Georgia State. Ben Kelly was the case authorized knife repairman. And he would go to knife shows and set up and polish knives there at the show, take them for repair. If you had a case with broken blade and you didn't send it to case, you sent it to one of their authorized repairmen. And he had a collection of his own, very knowledgeable and very talkative. And so I've sent a knife to case and who forwarded it to him with a broken blade. And I wrote Ben and I said, when it's ready, I will come pick it up. Simply because I wanted to meet him and I wanted to have an entree into his shop. And I figured this was the best way to do it. It took him about a year. Ben was never fast. About a year, he calls me up and says, your knife's ready. Do you want me to mail it to you? I said, no, I want to come by and pick it up because I live maybe 20 miles away. So I went to meet him. And from that, we developed a friendship. We started talking and hanging out together. And I would just go camp out at his shop when I wasn't in school, just trying to learn. Occasionally, I would help him, do things like wrap knives up. Never would let me get near a grinder with a knife. And so I would watch him and learning about knives. And we'd talk about knife history and all of that together because he was as enthused about it as I was. One day I walk in and he says, Jim Parker called me. And I dealt with Jim too, but we weren't close. And he said, Jim Parker called me. And there's a book publisher out of Alabama that's wanting to get into collectible books. And they have contacted Jim because he's the president of the National Knife Collector Association and the biggest dealer in the business. They want him to write a book. And Jim doesn't know how to write, but he knows the prices. So he asked me if I knew anybody that was a writer that would work on a knife book. And I told him that you were just the guy. So I load up and so I go to all my professors. I'm still in college now. And I go to all my professors, said, I've got this deal to do a book. How much should I charge? And I think I heard everything from a flat rate of $3,000. That's what the dean of the communications department said. Some of them said we charge so much a page. You charge so much a word, 5 cents a word. Went through that whole thing. So I had all this pumped up in my body. I'm going to demand this. And so we met at a knife show in Louisville, Kentucky, and went to Jim's room, and we're sitting there talking. I said, well, how do you want to do this book? I was going to, push really hard and demand that my name be listed on this book because I was already a collector dealing in knives, and I knew this was a way to get bigger in it by getting my name out there. Jim says, well, I think my name is worth something on the book. He said, I figure we'll both say by James F. Parker and Bruce Voyles, and I'm going to do the prices. You're going to do the writing. I'm going to make my money selling the book. I'll take 25% of the royalties, and you can have 75% of the royalties. A few days later, he said, I've been dealing with called me back, so I've been dealing with them, and the publishers are going to give us an advance, and they were guaranteed for 30,000 copies. I was making $6,500 a year at a newspaper. I was driving my own car at my own expense to sell ads when I was doing that, and the interviews and writing and all that. And I had a boss who once I showed him the first copy of my book, he became incensed and jealous because he had never written the book, but he had written training manuals in the military, and it just ate him alive. And it was real obvious and clear. And then he came in. The way the job was set up is I worked Monday in Copper Hill, Tennessee, doing reporting and editing and trying to sell ads. Tuesday is I was in Blue Ridge, Georgia, selling ads. Wednesday, I worked in the back shop at the Cherokee Scout in Murphy, North Carolina. Thursday, I also worked in the back shop and whatever. And then on Fridays, I would be back in Blue Ridge trying to sell ads. Well, you can't sell ads in a small country town on Fridays because that's when everybody gets their check and everybody's shopping, and nobody at the stores are willing to talk to you. So what I would do is, any overtime I obtained on Wednesdays and Thursdays, I would take off on Friday and go to knife shows. The thing was, I was making as much at knife shows on weekends doing what I enjoyed than I was working in this dead-end newspaper job. And but it was working because I could do the shows. I had the income, I had the steady income and insurance from the newspaper job. And out of the blue one day, this my boss comes up and says, your overtime is being taken, is earned in Murphy, but it's being taken against your job here in Blue Ridge, Georgia. So you can't take off Fridays anymore. And you don't tell somebody who's making more money doing that they need to quit, stay there. So I kind of pitched a fit and went over his head to the general boss of all of one company owned all of those different newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to the boss and said, I can't work for him anymore. And here's why, and laid it out for him. And I went back to work the next day, and the boss calls me in and said, I want your key. I said, why? He said, I'm firing you for insubordination. Now, I didn't know you could fire civilians for insubordination, but he did me, and it stuck. So I went back the next day to the boss, where I'd basically given him an ultimatum that I wouldn't work for that guy anymore, but I could work in the other two papers. And he said, we're thinking about having somebody come back in the fall to write high school sports, and we'll call you then. And I've waited 50-something years for that call, and it never has come. But the fascinating thing is, once we moved back to my hometown, they hired me, and I do a column every other week on local history, which is, another one of my things. I always enjoyed history. So the thing was, the book, though, here I was making $6,500 a year, making about the same selling knives on weekends. My end of the royalties on the book that first year was $13,500, more than double my current salary. And all of a sudden, this whole knife thing looked totally different. And where I was working at the newspaper, they were letting me use their equipment at night, and I was typesetting and producing the newsletter for the National Knife Collectors Association. When Jim found out I could write, and we started on the book, he switched me over into that too, which is making a little bit more money. And just on a whim, I made a 16-page newsletter and made it look a little like a magazine. And Jim said, well, I think we could do a magazine. Do you want to start a magazine? So I created National Knife Collector magazine, and we published it, and it was the official magazine for umpteen years there. I edited it until 1981. And so when I started editing it as a full-blown magazine, I actually got a decent salary. And plus selling knives on the weekends, in book royalties, I was rolling in high cotton for a while, I guess the best way to say it. And I was hooked. What else am I going to do? I've been editing knife magazines and writing about knives for right at 50 years.
That's incredible. It probably doesn't surprise me. In this, the military industrial complex, this idea of insubordination and skip leveling and everything like that is like highly frowned upon. but it's this. I heard once that generals don't dig trenches, and I guess probably like I'm vehemently against that mentality with within leadership, because the reality is that I will follow somebody who is willing to get in there and do the dirty work, in order to make sure that things are done and done appropriately. I have a really hard time where people sit in ivory towers and try to make decisions and everything like that, and it's generally less trustworthy. So I mean, he made the decision for you, right? Like he pushed you in a direction where I guess God's pressing you in this vein of knives and everything, and you just like went to the races with it. It's incredible
Well,
to me.
well, Bob Lovelace once told me that he had never had a door shut behind him if there wasn't one better opened up in front of him. And you know, Bob was absolutely one of the most articulate people that I've ever met. He could sum something up in 5 sentences that was complex and hard to understand, and he did that. That's why he was so ultimately quotable, and that's how he ended up in things like Sports Illustrated and became such a leader in the business that he was. He was a very savvy businessman. Uh, Diverting on to Bob Lovelace for just a minute. One of the things that Bob did that collectors, I'm not sure if they understand how important it was, but his first knives were Delaware made, and not a lot of people know. It's possible to find a Delaware made knife and not know what you have because it just says Delaware made on it. But if you pick up a Bob Lovelace knife, it's going to say R.W. Lovelace maker and the town that he was in. All of them. It could be Lawndale, it's going to be Riverside, every town. So he put his full name on it, and he put the location of where he was. So if you see a Lovelace knife and you wanted one, you said, "Where can I get one?" Well, it wasn't a mystery. You look in the phone book under Bob Lovelace in Riverside, California, and you're going to reach Bob. There's a plethora of knife makers who are Blue Tick Forge or JMZ or some of these, or a bell or something like that stamped on the knife, and nobody has a clue who the heck they are. And as an auctioneer, I go absolutely insane with some of these subtle marks and some guy that's not necessarily well known, trying to figure out who the heck he really is. And there's no person that has a reliable database of this kind of information. Mark Zaleski at Knife Magazine is trying his best to assemble it, and but it's never really been accomplished yet. And there are a lot of knife makers whose business is failing because they are not proud enough of their work to put their full name on it or where they're located. And it's so absolutely basic to business, it's mind boggling. I've written about this in Knife Magazine, but the other thing that it's a quote from Bill Adams, used to run Atlanta Cutlery, is it's hard to tell someone that knows everything anything because they already know everything. That's a very common phrase to be used in a lot of the knife business.
Oh yeah. And I come very humbly from, like, I don't know what I don't know until I know it. So I mean, I always assume the fool. Like I mean, I really, if I look at the entire I guess stream of data from the beginning of recorded history to now, I know such a small amount. But like, I think that there's a deep desire. Maybe it's just from imposter syndrome or feeling stupid when I was a kid and everything, that I just search out everything I possibly can just to gain a context into the next thing that I'm supposed to learn. And I mean, that is where your work has been very influential to me, because your body of work has been so referenceable to me in learning the industry and appreciating those who've come before me, and being able to evaluate the, not only the history but the context at which these things exist in time. And it's a very few people that can be so referenceable. You are like a currently living Wikipedia for the knife industry.
Well, I'm not sure about that because I learn something about knives every day. Still, I mean, there's no stopping it. It's just like every time we get a new consignment in, uh, there's something new there. So, man, I didn't know they made this. Isn't this kind of interesting? Uh, I don't necessarily go to the history of the companies themselves the way I used to. What I would do when I was doing the books is like I didn't know a history of Powell Cutler, so I started calling people where the factories was. What I would do is I would call the librarian in the town, and I would ask them who is the best local historian. Because if they're a local historian, that librarian's going to know who they are because they're camping out there. And they would always give me a name, and I would call that name, and then they would say, "Oh, you need to, oh yes, I remember the Cutler Company. You need to talk to so and so. He used to work there." And they would in turn give me a call. So I would end up talking to original factory people that had worked there that knew the history minutely. So, and then I just turn on the recording and listen. And it was just, and that would lead to other people. I remember one guy, I was trying to figure out what had happened to the Powell cutlery, to the old Remington original factory stuff. Remington built their cutlery pieces from scratch at the end of World War I in 1920. They went out of the business in 1940 when they started tooling up to make munitions for World War II. They sold all their equipment to Powell Cutler. Through going through the library, I talked to a guy named Raymond Petro, and he was in charge at Powell Cutler of being the man who broke the machinery into pieces and sold it as salvage. But he was able to give me a concrete date that was 1953. And so, boom, I've got a fact nobody else knew. And unfortunately, at the time he told me this, he had throat cancer and didn't live more than a few months later. And so I did this for a lot of the cutlery companies, and basically just putting the time in. And now, even now, you find an old hardware catalog, or you find an obituary of somebody like E.C. Simmons. E.C. Simmons, in his obituary, said he had a mania for knives, and few of his friends and acquaintances owned a knife that he had not examined minutely. Now, this is a man who started E.C. Simmons Hardware, Keen Cutter Knives. The brand was later bought by one of his former employees, Norvell Shapley, that started Shapley and Diamond Edge. He would go, then Simmons would also buy Walden Cutlery to produce knives for his company. Walden Cutlery would later be bought by Winchester. And so, it's like a very tangled family tree in the knife thing. And for the people too, same way. And the friendships and all that, it just kind of networks out. Uh, I think the one thing that may be different about me is, as far as research material, is I am a guy that was trained to write, and I'm a knife guy. There are not a lot of people that have that combination. Uh, there's a lot of guys that like knives. There aren't a lot of guys that are trained writers that love knives. Even, and without saying this inappropriately, there are a lot of editors of past editors of knife magazines that didn't give a hoot about knives. They're writing because they're writers. They weren't, the definition I always had was when a knife guy goes to the restroom, he'll take a knife magazine with him to read. And if you're a writer about knives and editing a knife magazine and you're taking the sports page with you, the difference between those are going to show over time. And if I bring anything to it, it's just an enthusiasm for knives.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. There's a lot to unpack about what you just said. One, I do agree, when it comes to marking blades and showing pride in your work, that as a knife maker, there is, it's probably the modern culture of creating businesses and, kitschy names and stuff that probably contributes towards, uh, creating a brand instead of, your brand is you as a person, right? We've gone, people are more familiar with the Nike swoosh than they are, somebody's actual name being associated with their product or output. And so it becomes very difficult because, in the context of the Knife Makers Guild and getting inquiries for people's work there, or the Texas Knife Makers Guild, or any of these places that I'm kind of involved with, or see questions and identification come through, it becomes very, very difficult to ascertain time, place, origin, maker, all of those things. And people, as collectors, they want to know where these things are coming from, and what context or um, provenance their things have. And a maker that doesn't mark their blades really doesn't do the collector's market service. And I actually look at that in my own collecting as a sign that if I buy something and invest in it and I don't have the ability to show provenance, it becomes a slight turnoff to me.
Well, it's not just that. We're dealing with what I call a knife maker mentality. Now, first of all, as a knife maker, and I'm talking in very general terms here, you're not going to be a good employee for somebody else because you're so darn independent. Because you don't want to work for somebody else, you want to be independent. Now, as a knife maker, that means that you spend a lot of time out in a garage or a shop by yourself making these knives. Because when you've got a buffer going at 3,500 RPM or 1,750, and you've got a sharp blade up against that, it's not the time to be having a conversation with somebody. It's like Gil Hibben was buffing a knife one day. It caught in the buffer, and he lost it. He couldn't see it. Didn't know where it was. He looked down, it was sticking through his thigh.
Oh,
And
man.
he said he just had about a tenth of a second word like "oh crap" flashed through his mind before the pain hit, and it had cut an artery. He nearly, it was nearly fatal, but he got over it. He corrected it. But when you're dealing around that kind of machinery, it's not a group activity, and so there's something about being by yourself that much time in a day that does something to your head a little bit. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It just you look at things different. I remember once Lovelace, one of my favorite Lovelace's parables, you might say. He said when we were at a show together, and he were talking, and he pointed in the room and said, "Now look at the guy in there. He has he's going to come in and he's going to sell 20 knives, and he's selling them for $200 a piece, and he's got $100 in equipment and I mean in materials and time, and figuring his time at about $20 an hour. Uh, he's got $2,000. He paid $500 for the table. He doesn't do any advertising. He's paying $750 for the room, and first thing he's gonna say with that cash in his pocket is, "Where's the best restaurant in town for me and Mama?" Because he's been in that shop for months and he doesn't have a chance to go out and party, and he's going to go to a real good restaurant. Says he's going to spend over the next 3 days, he's going to spend $500 going to restaurants. He said the SOB's bankrupt and he don't even know
And that is even true today. That culture of seclusion, and then uh, socializing is apparent inside of like Blade Show's pit. Like, I mean, everybody kind of goes there and wiles out because they haven't seen anybody for the last year. Maybe if they do a few shows a year, and it definitely is a place where you can move and shake things and network. But it definitely is also a place where you could spend a lot of money on drink and food and all that stuff too.
Well, the reason that it was called the pit, do you know the history of that?
No, sir. I'd like you to tell me though.
At the old guild site at the Crown Center in Kansas City, which was for years where the guild show was held. In the bar downstairs, they had a step down bar like they have at the Blade Show. And it was called the Pit there. And that's where all the shakers and movers would go to. And that was where, I could go down there and I would be talking to Linton McKenzie on engraving. And at the same time, on the other side of me is Nate Posner, who runs San Francisco Gun Exchange, was one of the primary buyers for years. Matter of fact, the Knife Makers Guild gives the Nate Posner Award, which is the highest award they give to someone that's not a knife maker. And, not a lot of people even know who he is anymore. And they also give an award for the best to one knife maker a year called the Red Watson Friendship Award on who's the most helpful and nicest person. And Paul Bash used to he would try to buy a red Watson knife, and for years at the guild, whoever won that award, he would give them a red Watson knife. And he quit after about 6 or 7 years because he said of all the people he had given that red Watson knife to, not a one had told him thank you.
That's unfortunate. But that that is very customary, though. Like going back to the knife maker is like the driving force or the artist in this industry, right? But they're also, I mean, speaking as a knife maker, like the worst enemy of the knife industry in some ways because of how obtusely they think. Like you think that as a sole producer of something that you would be very business minded, that everything would be taken seriously, you'd be pragmatic, you'd have an appropriate attention towards your customer base and the market at large. But it seems like for the most part it's not that way. And I can't imagine, like, you get an award and you get, like, for me, if I get an award and somebody is giving me a knife as a result of that, I'm looking at that guy and wondering in what context is he able to give away a knife? And not only am I appreciative because I don't, middle child syndrome, I don't get given a lot of things. I have to take it if I want it. But, there, I don't understand why appreciation isn't given or attribution given appropriately. Those are all, to me, core tenets of being a good business person too, as well as just being a good person.
Well, I think you said it early on. Is these are artists we're talking about, and with this comes an artist mentality. I think you'll find few artists, true artists, that are good businessmen or business people. Uh, there's no reason they should be. They're not trained to do that. They're trained to make beautiful knives. They don't know anything. You might find a few that were a businessman that got into knives and can read a balance sheet and make a great knife at the same time. There's very few, if any, of those. That's not to say we don't have educated knife makers. I mean, Fred Carter had a doctorate in biology and made great knives, but that doesn't necessarily make anybody a great businessman either. So there's only very few people who have had the savvy to make that combination of being a good business person and a good knife maker to make it work. Bob Lovelace was the first by far. And he tried to tell everybody, and all he did was get people mad at him. Jimmy Lyle was one of those who did that. The best living example I can give you is Daniel Winkler. He is a super person. And because of he and his wife Karen Shook Winkler, because of their combined savvy, they are absolutely produce probably the most success of a custom knife maker in this business right now, because they transitioned from making traditional knives with Native American themes, primitive stuff, because he originally was a buckskinner, went to rendezvous and things. And he transitioned from that into making axes and tactical knives. Ended up making the knives that SEAL Team 6 carried on the Bin Laden raid. And from that, he had a special operator come in and showed him an axe he wanted to talk about designing. And he said, I need them for my troops. And he said, but the problem is you're getting, a lot of money for this axe, and we're talking about guys on enlisted man's pay. Daniel comes up and he says, well, I tell you what, let me think on this. And then he said, well, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to call my regular customers, and if they will pay me for one axe, then I will make one axe free and donate it to somebody on some of the teams. And that's exactly what he did. And that's why he got mentioned in the book about the Bin Laden raid and became, and after that, everybody had to have one of those. And then those two axes on the wall behind the guy in the terminal list, those are Winkler-made axes. And from that, he went into full-time production and going with Winkler knives too. And like I say, most knife makers, they make their knives, they sell them, they spend the money, and they sit back and say, I'm happy. Doesn't necessarily make it very successful at it. And, it's best to be a full-time knife maker if you've got a full-time job to back it up.
That's the truth.
And there aren't a lot of that's a real tough thing. And in the knife business also, we've got a lot of guys selling knives on Facebook now. And what they're doing is they're doing collectible knives, aftermarket knives, knives. They're not buying knives from a factory or a distributor. They're buying these old collectible knives, going to knife shows, scarfing them up, looking for collections, things like that, then singling them out to this audience that they've created on Facebook. What they don't understand is the only person that has really ever made a living buying and selling knives that have already been produced was Rhett Stedham. And he did that and created the Randall Club and some things like that. Jim Parker started out doing that, but he quickly realized that, and he became wealthy when he started importing knives out of Japan. Now, he would later buy Case, later start a factory in Jacksonville, Alabama, that is now Bear & Son. He also would buy, at the same time, Cutlery World Stores, which was the largest chain of cutlery stores in America. He had them all three at one time. He had some health issues, and he did not have good support people that he could let run it while he was dealing with his health issues. And when he came out, the whole thing bankrupted. It was a $70 million bankruptcy. But the thing to keep in mind is he had accumulated $70 million as the ability to raise $70 million that he owed people selling knives.
Wow. Yeah, I don't. I mean, that's incredible. First of all, I mean, it's. I don't. I don't think that people realize like there can be a business at this thing. We're not talking about chump change in most cases. If you could do things intelligently and use your resources and wits to build that, but oftentimes people don't think that. They think one $350 knife at a time.
Well, too, you're selling, particularly with these new Facebook guys that are trying to do well and buy vintage knives, for instance. Now, they're selling, say, $10,000 on a good night of vintage knives. But when you finish, where do you go to get more knives? You don't call up a factory and say, send me a couple of more dozen. All you do is you go out and have to dig them again. So when their show ends, when their Facebook sale ends, the next thing they want to do is, where am I going to go buy some more? Well, this is multiplying. So now you've got more people scarfing the bushes for these vintage knives. And there is a finite group of these knives out there. Now, this does cause the prices to bump up a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. But these people that are trying to do this to make money are feeding a cavernous beast. And it is a beast that must be fed, and you've got to keep new knives coming. I used to sell knives on television, on Shop at Home Television. It was a satellite network, and later did them for America's Collectibles Network and then Panda Network out of California. And even did Jim Shopping Channel. I did some shows for them. And even dealing in modern and production, having access to all of these factories and things. When you would put a 1 week, you put a brand new knife just come out or a brand new set or some kind of thing. You'd sell 20 the first week, 10 the second, and then 3 and 4 the next week. It always had to be something new. And one of the things we started to do that as a result of this show is I went to Gerber and some of these other people and I said, just do this. I said, these new knives coming out, just send me 50 of them, but I want you to put first production run on the knife. And that came about from me as a result of needing knives for this TV show I was doing. And so, a lot of people do not know where that originated, but that's where it came from. Gerber were the first to do it. John Reinschreiber, a friend of mine, was working at Gerber, and I was explaining to him what I needed, and the two of us kind of came up with putting first production run. Now everybody does it, but it's one of the things you do, and nobody knows it, and it doesn't make any money for you. Just like Michael Walker invented the locking liner, and he didn't patent it. Everybody in America has copied it and produced it. He doesn't make any money off of it. Of course, Michael, being the artist that he is, has made up for it in spectacular stuff otherwise. It sells knives, probably one of the highest priced knives in America, and sells them as fast as he can make them. But it's earned.
Yeah. And there's weird serendipity. I try to like connect threads in this industry. I think probably it's like my researcher's mind. And it seems like you're talking about with Bob Loveless where one door closes, another opens right in front of you. And it seems like when you're doing the right things or the right kind of things that there's really not many scenarios where you get pushed into obscurity. But I mean, that is one thing that I see. Again, talking about like attribution and where ideas come from. That I think it's a fiduciary duty for people to really understand this. That's kind of what I'm doing with the podcast. I love that you are like a pioneer in that because again, you are like my reference for a lot of things, even though sometimes I don't realize it until after the fact. I'm constantly coming back to the wellspring that you've created and um, trying to make inroads so that way we can contextually understand that as knife makers and people within the craft, if all that makes sense.
Well, it's important to me how some of these things came to be. Uh, it's sort of like the roots of it, and if you don't know how it came to be, it's hard to really understand the whole picture because there's little nuances in there. Just take for instance the Blade Show. Uh, Jim Parker was producing through the National Knife Collectors Association, producing 7 or 8 shows a year. They're all good shows. And at the Knife Makers Guild show, after we bought Blade magazine, it was American Blade then. After we bought Blade magazine, we took it, went to the first Knife Makers Guild show, or at least a Knife Makers Guild, first one for us. And we were, selling knives, and I mean, not selling knives, selling subscriptions and meeting everyone there. And I think this was the one where Moran introduced Damascus for the first time. He was selling it for $1,000 an inch. If it's 3-inch blade, it's $3,000. And they were lining up to buy them. Kronk was there with some of his fantastic things. And it was just, it was a fantastic time to be getting into knives. It was like 70, It was 1981. That's what it was. And I'd been to Knife Makers Guild show when they were combined shows, like in Dallas, Texas, in 1976. And in 1976, that's probably where the idea started. Is Wally Beinfield and H.E. Russell put on a show together at Market Hall in Dallas. And in this, they had the Texas Gun Collectors Association on one end. They had a National Knife Collectors show. They had the Knife Makers Guild show. And the ABS had not yet been formed. And they had the formation show of the Antique Bowie Knife Collectors Association. Plus, they had manufacturer booths. And it was a bust. I mean, they had all these hotels lined up. They had buses running between the hotels. And it was that particular year, there was just so much drama within the various organizations that it just didn't come off. But I was there, and to go there, it's the first time I've ever flown on an airplane even. And I was set up there buying and selling and meeting some of these guys that I'd only heard about. And of course, the book had come out, so they all knew who I was now. And it was fantastic. And I always wanted to reproduce that. I went back in 77 and nobody came. It had been reduced, and then they never tried to do it again after that. And so I always had that in the back of my mind that if there was some way that we could combine all of those together, it would be a fantastic show. And we went, so when Parker and I went to the first Knife Makers Guild show together, we saw them, saw the crowd coming in, and he looked at me and said, we could do this too if we only had one show a year. And that was part of the core idea for the Blade Show, along with the Dallas Expo setup. Then in 1981, we just bought Blade. We went to the SHOT Show, Shooting Hand Outdoor Trade Show, because they had it in Atlanta and it was close. And I'm walking up and down these aisles and I'm seeing all of these manufacturers had massive booths. And I said, man, if we could get people like the Knife Makers Guild people here and the pocket knife people here and have some manufacturers booths, this would be a huge show. We need to combine all of these together. And I remember Dale Everett, a knife dealer from Cleveland, Tennessee, and I were walking, and he looked around and said, boy, in the big leagues, walking down the aisle of the SHOT Show, said, boy, we're in the big leagues now, aren't we? And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in the big leagues. And so we started, and because of, you've got to bear in mind, these were different worlds. Nobody had any crossover whatsoever. So you had one side of the room that we put pocket knife people in. We put the booths in the middle, and on the other side, we had the custom show, custom end of it. So really, we had three tiny shows in one, but nobody crossed that aisle. It was like a bunch of Democrats and Republicans. And we had, and the interesting thing to me, and totally different styles, because the pocket knife and vintage knife people, they would be at the door, kicking the door at 7:30 when the show didn't open till 8. And at 5:30, at the show closed at 6, at 5:30, they're covered up and they're all gone to dinner. Over on the handmade side, they're not coming in till 9 or 10 at 9 or 10 in the morning. They're staying till you have to run them out, so you're not getting everybody out to the show till about 6:30 because they're still closing deals. Because at that time, the Knife Makers Guild group was a lot more hard partiers than the pocket knife guys. Pocket knife guys were church-going people, and you wouldn't find them in the bar partying or anything else. They wanted to get in early. They wanted to leave early to go to dinner and go to bed, go to the room. Pocket and the handmade people, they wanted to party. And the beauty of it was I was in both groups, so I could transition. and the knife makers, we had so few booths going down the middle. Parker we had Leatherman come in for a booth. Tim Leatherman was there, and Frank Buster took booth, and Lansky Sharpeners. And from that, I said, we need to figure out a way to get more advertising about the show. And so what we said is we're gonna, and I was watching television one night, and this car was the Motor Trend Knife of the Year. This was the Road and Track car of the year, Road and Track Car of the Year, Car and Driver Car of the Year. And I said, man, we need to do that. So that's where the idea came from. So we did the Blade Magazine Knife of the Year awards. Now there was an ulterior motive to this, is because if you don't come to the show, you don't get chosen for the award. So you had to be there for the judging, which was an incentive to get these manufacturers to come to the show, because there was a huge amount of resistance then. But they couldn't rationalize it for their selling to wholesalers like they were doing then. But now, if they're going to get an award like that, maybe this is worth coming to. As a part of that, the 1 year, Buck was the first one to grab the idea, and they made a little stand up that this knife had won American Made Knife of the Year. And from the podium at the banquet that night, I held this up and I said, this is what you're supposed to do with the Knife of the Year award. Pretty soon, everybody in all of their ads, winner of such as the Blade Magazine Knife of the Year, such and such, American Made Knife of the Year, imported Knife of the Year, and everybody was running these ads in all of my competitors. So I was getting the Blade Magazine name out there everywhere. I mean, I couldn't, we didn't have a budget to run ads in American Rifleman. But if Buck ran an ad in American Rifleman and they said Blade Magazine Knife of the Year, if a knife collector sees that, he's going to say, Knife Magazine? I didn't know there's a knife magazine. Where can I find this magazine? And boom, away we went. It was, so that grew, and all of these other groups grew to the point that we moved to Knoxville. We had 70,000 square feet in Knoxville. So we had umpteen tables. One time, I think the most we ever had there was a 700 table show at that time in the 80s. And what happened was the manufacturers had their booth set up, and it was slow for them. They were just there to try to get the Knife of the Year award. So the owners of these factories would go wandering around, and they would go into the vintage knife section, and where they would see some nice old vintage knife, they'd buy it and make one like that. They would go into the handmade section, and here's these great knives. Well, maybe I can make one like this. Well, let me talk to the maker. That's where the collaborations originated. Out of the boredom at the Blade Show, the manufacturers had nothing to do except go wander in those various sections. And again, another boost to the group. I was always under the guise of rising tide raises all boats. Anything I could do to make the entire knife business grow was going to be good for everybody in the long run. So I was always promoting. I mean, even locally, I'd go speak at the Optimist Club. And at one time, if you had a regional club, I sent a note to all of them. If you want me to come speak, let me know. So I was driving all over the Southeast, going to these regional knife clubs for their monthly meetings, and meeting some great people while I was doing it. But and from that too, we had a lot of knife people that were passing, and certainly getting up there in age. And I wanted to find some way to honor most of these guys while they were still alive. And B.R. Hughes had written an article in Knife World that there needed to be a Cutlery Hall of Fame. And that's all he ever did with it. But that idea stuck in my mind. And so I said, we're already doing a free banquet. If you're a Life member, you got a free banquet that night. It's full. We're already doing at that banquet announcing the Knife of the Year awards. And so we need to create a Blade Magazine Cutlery Hall of Fame. And we did. Now, my criteria at the time was it was somebody that not necessarily had worked in a factory job at a knife factory for 50 years and had worked a regular job and just did their job for 50 years. This was somebody that had to do more, and it had to have something extra to give something extra. take, for instance, George Herron. George Herron made a great knife. He sold great knives. He was a former president of the Knife Makers Guild. But he was instrumental in starting the South Carolina Knife Makers Association. And there, at that time, I could have named 20 knife makers who got their start going to George Herron's shop and letting him show them how to do it. That was Hall of Fame type stuff. Now, the criteria has changed. And I think it has lessened the importance of being a Cutlery Hall of Fame member. And it's sad. That part of it's sad. The the way I got in is George Herron and Ken Warner came up to the podium when we were getting ready to announce the Cutlery Hall of Fame awards, and they said, "We want to speak." Well, both good friends said, "Okay." I didn't think. And so at this point, they announced that by acclamation and a unanimous vote by the existing Hall of Fame members that they were inducting me because they knew as me running the Hall of Fame, and at that time I was just picking on myself, that there would be that I would never put myself in. So once they put me in, I said, well, if they've done this by a vote, this will sure take me out of having to worry about it. So that's when the Hall of Fame members started picking the other people that would be in the Hall of Fame because I felt they were very qualified to pick that. And so all of that basically spun out from the Blade Show. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it's incredible. An incredible lineage. I have some questions as it relates to the Cutlery Hall of Fame in its current state. So, my understanding is it's no longer a unanimous vote, right? But I'm not really familiar with what the actual criteria is, and I don't know if that's actually if it's publicly available. Is it?
Well, tell you the truth, I don't know. I've since I started it, I kind of took a back seat to everything as much as I could. I vote for the people I think that need to be in it, but I don't have anything to do with the running of it or anything other than I'm just a member of the Cutlery Hall of Fame. We always had the Hall of Fame members vote. You could nominate someone, then they would produce a biography about them so everybody would know who we were talking about and their contributions and why they had been nominated. And then they would pick the votes, and with me, it was always, I gave a consideration to somebody that was still alive, that was older, that deserved the honor and could receive it in person. Now, I'm proud to say that because of that, Bo Randall received the Cutlery Hall of Fame in person. And I was there to shake his hand and hand it to him. And it was one of the premier moments of my life because for many ways, he was the handmade industry as far as the start of it in that early era. Same way with Dewey Ferguson, Pete Gerber. When Pete Gerber went in, I went to the Oregon show and flew in a couple of days early to take Pete and Pody out to dinner and announce it to them there at dinner. It was a very nice dinner, by the way. And they were very happy to receive that award and come to the show and accept it. Same way with Albert Bear, Uncle Henry Bear. Just there are a lot of legends, Jimmy Lyle, that came into the Hall of Fame while they were able to accept it. My favorite one was when we inducted Houston Price, because Houston Price was a competitor, but he was also a good guy, and he had made his contributions, and and we get together and play guitars and stuff. He was a fantastic guitar picker, and and we one time we even entertained at one of the banquets, the two of us together playing, and but he was sitting at the table with us, and he said, and he pretty well had said there that as long as Bruce is running Blade, I'll never be in the Cutlery Hall of Fame. And he couldn't understand why all of his family was there too until we announced it, and we totally surprised him, blindsided him. But one of the others was Ken Warner and A.G. Russell. Neither one of them were banquet type people. So what I did is I asked A.G. to do the introductory speech, the announcement speech for Ken Warner. And then I asked Ken Warner, I said, I need you to come to the banquet because I need you to do the introductory speech for H.E. Russell. So they were going to do each other's introductory speech and didn't know that both of them were going in the Cutlery Hall of Fame. And we're sitting at the table with them. And at that time, we were talking about, there was some controversial stuff going on in knife legislation, and some of these people were caving to it. And I had the poem marked in a book of Kipling about paying the Dane Geld. Once you don't pay the Dane Geld, or you'll never get rid of the Dane. And I was going to read it to the banquet. And it came as part of a 2-volume set. And A.G. and Ken were sitting at the table with me, and they looked at that set. That's the book we're missing. They both had the first volume of the 2-volume set. They couldn't find the second volume, but I had the second volume. And so we were talking about that, and then Ken goes to do his speech, and about halfway through it, AG figures out what's going on. And the looks on their faces. I mean, so part of the Cutlery Hall of Fame thing was honoring people that needed to be honored, hopefully during their lifetime. Part of it was these little twists like that. And I don't know what they do with that now. You know, when I sold Blade Magazine, since it was a part of Blade Magazine, that entity went with it. And so it's theirs. It's despite being a Cutlery Hall of Fame, it's not a nonprofit thing. It is owned by Blade Magazine and the owners of Blade Magazine. Yeah. And so they changed the rules recently that not only the Hall of Fame members could vote, but they had special outside secret people in the business that were qualified who were going to vote. Haven't announced who these quote qualified people are. I wonder if they think that the Cutlery Hall of Fame people aren't qualified to pick the other people in the industry. That's a question they never really answered. But when that subject came up, to be honest, some of the Hall of Fame people brought it on themselves because you got 2 votes. You got one vote counted 2 points and one voted 1 point. So you got your first and second choices. So you had people calling each other and saying, look, I'll vote for your guy if you vote your second vote for my guy. And they were doing this based on whatever clique they might be in. And that was not the way it was meant to be either. That was, I guess if there's a fault with that, it was when I turned it over to them by popular election that I didn't put restrictions on communicating with each other and collusion. And so I guess I'll take responsibility for that being screwed up.
Well, we talking earlier about nobody going across the aisle like Democrats and Republicans, very similarly to what gets done in Congress with the Hall of Fame. I'm reminded though, I thought that my wife's grandparents, that their trust and will was ironclad, but you see, like it takes one generation to screw up the inheritance that they've received, and to collude and to backstab and everything like that, to totally disrupt the original spirit of a trust or will, and not too much different than what's happened.
Well, I don't think that has ever really changed. If you look at how the kings of England were always killing brothers and stuff and nephews to make sure they had the throne enhanced for their own succession. And one thing about the generations that I have come to realize is my generation were children of people who had gone through the Great Depression and World War II. And that affected them horribly. My mom said that she remembered one Christmas where all she got for Christmas was an orange. My grandmother said that they were subsistence farmers and they grew or raised everything they ate except for sugar and coffee, and they traded eggs for the sugar and the coffee. The men of the family picked up every odd job they could find just so they could pay the taxes on the property. And they did, this was not a 1 year thing. This went on for several years. And it affected them forever. And part of that was after all the banks closed during the Great Depression, they didn't trust banks. They did trust buying and holding something in your hand that had value. And so they were all collectors. If you look at the rise of gun collecting, it was post World War II. If you look at all of this, you look at knife collecting, it arose because gun collecting became government restricted in 1968. That the knife collectors and their association with guns primarily came is because most of the early guys were gun dealers, but with the restrictions of the 1968 Gun Control Act, they couldn't ship and sell guns across state lines like that. But knives they could. And so that was a very strong, popular thing. But generations have their way of thinking affected by the environment in which they grew up. That's just the way life is. So there are a lot of things that that my generation had in common that the following generations they don't know about. It's not pertinent to what they live. For me, my dream car was a Mustang GT 350 that shook the ground when you cranked it up. I mean, that's the car I've dreamed of. Never got one, by the way. I had a 69 Mustang, but it wasn't anywhere near that. Or a 68 Chevelle with a 396 board engine in it. Or, they got 6 or 7 miles to the gallon, but gas was 50 cents a gallon. So this generation, the future generation, had to adapt, and they have different values and different things and different connections. Like in these mountains where I live, we all had and probably still do, if you can tell it, we got a very distinct Western North Carolina mountain accent because what we spoke is closest to the mother tongue, Elizabethan English, because it was isolated in these mountain hollows. And then satellite dishes came in, and all of a sudden our children learned how to put like in every third word in a sentence. And I think for future generations, the COVID isolation is going to be a generational affecting thing. Life has been different ever since for everybody. But for those kids that had to go to school for a year by looking at a computer screen, their life's never going to be the same about it. And they're going to think about things different from the way we did. There was a theory one time, I think it was Marshall McLuhan came out with this theory, is that when they were talking about what they called the generation gap, is that children prior to boomers were raised with books to read, and they read and everything was in a line. They called them linear thinkers. And when television came along, and children born in the 50s, the television became a babysitter for them. And everybody watched television. But if you go slow with a television or you shoot it with a camera, you can see the whole picture is never showing. It's a rolling bar, and you're only seeing half the picture at a time. But your mind's making you think it's a complete picture. And his theory was, he called those simultaneous thinkers that see that. So he said the reason that the older generation for me was different is the linear thinkers that had read straight lines in their early formative years versus people that were seeing half a picture at a time and their mind having to compensate for it. And I always accepted, well, okay, that made sense to me. And some of the kids' things, we had a a good kid we liked, had a lot of common things in common with my wife and I and his family, and we liked him very well. And my daughter was dating him, and to him, he would have made the to us he would have made the ideal son-in-law. And we mentioned this to my daughter. My daughter said he might have made a great son-in-law for you all. It's the problem is would he made a great husband for me? And I don't think so. So I accept now that we have different values and different ways of thinking things. And with some kids anymore, I I can't talk to them. Even my grandkids, it's really hard to find something to talk about together.
Yeah. Well, there's several things I think on with that. My wife and I talk about that. So I'm 37. She's 42. We'll be 42 this year. But what we talk about is the difference between how we relate to our children, because my wife firmly grew up as we would call it Generation X, right? So she grew up in a analog world, but then was introduced to technology later on, right? And I have this very weird compilation because I grew up not only analog, but I mean, you know how the hills are. I mean, I grew up in Pennsylvania in the hollers, basically, and I grew up very poor. In fact, what uh, you mentioned about growing up in depression and having a orange for Christmas, there was one Christmas where my parents bought a case of oranges for me and my seven siblings, and that's what we had because that's what money we had, and so it was a rare treat. But we ate on those oranges until they rotted, and that was it. Um, but there's an adage that you see go around in the I guess the zeitgeist of memes and stuff on the internet today, and it's hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, right? And this cyclical nature of you do something hard and endure, and then you try to course correct and make sure your kids don't ever have that problem, and then that is the thing that creates weak kids, and then they create hard times, and then the cycle repeats. And I'm pretty sure, as analogies go, that's fairly accurate, and we're on the weak men create hard times phase of society right now.
I do think we're going to see with the hard times for certain. It's and what worries me is um, is the ability of basically the war fighters we're not raising. I had a good friend of mine, a special ops, retired special ops guy, and he said, and we met at a winery in Myrtle Beach weekend before last, and we were sitting there talking, and he said, to me, he said still moves in those circles, and he said, the only war fighters we have right now are basically the airborne troops and the special ops units. He said, your rank and file guys, it's just all of this diversity stuff. They're worrying more about that than teaching them how to shoot a 50 caliber machine gun. And I heard a quote the other day about the diversity, that one of the issues they were having was the 82nd Airborne was having trouble recruiting enough LBGTQ people to fill out the roles, which is, I, well, when I grew up, I would go outside and play Army because I had heroes and I read stories of these heroes, and these heroes were put to me up as examples. And I read books and stories and taught in school about Daniel Boone and Kit Carson and Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp and all of these, uh, John Fremont, all of the, even Custer, all these people that did great things. And that was, I don't see that in my children anymore. I had to explain to my grandson, who is born in Texas, what the Alamo really meant. And it's just a strange world that I have trouble dealing with. And what I'm dealing with, I'm dealing it, but I have to understand it. I have trouble understanding the motivations of some of these people anymore.
Yeah, it's an identity crisis, I think, at the end of the day. You know,
Well,
what were you going to say?
let me break in here and say one thing. And it's a quote from Ron Lake at the Knife Makers Guild Show meeting that I think is perhaps the most profound thing that I've ever heard in a guild group. And to me, it should be the core foundation of every knife related group. Ron stepped up, he was vice president of the Knife Makers Guild at the time, and he said, if we want to be a great organization, we have to do great things.
Yeah. Uh, I, I I think the things that are most profound are the things that you actually have to sit and think about. Like, what does that actually mean? Great things, right? And for me, great things are often the hardest things to do. You don't ever get anything good out of sitting on your ass and waiting for them to happen to you. You have to go out and get them, right? It's a whether you're like scientifically minded and believe in the laws of entropy or whatever, it's far easier for things to be destroyed than it is to create. And if you're a creator, if you innovate, if you find new ways to do things that put random things together and make it better, that's greatness, right? But you leave things alone and they start to decay, just the same way as society, the same way as rusty blades, the same thing as homes or cities or things like that. You leave it alone, you don't care about it, and it starts to fester and then die off.
Yeah, well, I think it's well said because you have to take care of what you have. If you've got a bunch of Damascus blades, you better keep the suckers oiled. And I've seen some in our latest auction. We had a Ron Fraser knife that a very wealthy collector had a massive collection. And this one was in a case, and I don't know if it got wet or what, but we opened the case when he consigned it to me for auction, and it was rusted all to pieces. And this was a super nice art knife in a fitted case and everything. And Ron Fraser stuff's top notch. It brings huge money. But this one, it just made you want to cry. It was just a sad, sad thing. But back to the working on it. I think part of it's a work ethic because it's not easy for kids today to have a work ethic like we had. My dad worked as a union pipe fitter, and he drove 2 hours one way on these curvy mountain roads to commute to work in the union jobs in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He did this for 20 something years. He did this every day. He'd get up at 4 in the morning, ride down, work a construction job all day long as a pipe fitter, come back, come home, have supper, take a shower. And then they were building a resort community over on the lake 3 miles from where we lived. I would go with him and hold the flashlight, and he would work doing plumbing in these new houses because he was the only plumber in that end of the county. And this was not PVC pipe you just put dope on and screw together. This was cast iron pipe. You had to saw off, beat off with a chisel. You had to pack the joints with oakum and pour hot lead in them and then beat that in. And it was all copper tubing that had to be sweated with lead. And I mean, it was hard physical work. There was a full-time job for somebody. He was doing this in the night after he got home. Next morning, get up 4 o'clock and go again. They also ran at the same time. My mom was running a small country grocery store, and they had a 3-unit motel. Plus, they had rental properties. And if they rented them furnished or unfurnished, and invariably, if the guy had it furnished, the next guy wanted it unfurnished, we had to move all the furniture out of it. Constant. And so I grew up thinking that you didn't waste time on anything. You didn't waste time on. I mean, we went swimming 2 times a year. We went camping once a year early on until I got old enough to go on my own. But as far as my dad's activities, he was too busy working and trying to build something to give to us. And so I had that in my mind because it seems like I've always worked 3 and 4 jobs. If I was editing a magazine, I'm still buying and selling knives on the side. I'm still writing on the side and doing other things. At any given moment, I've had 3 or 4 jobs. Like right now, at this moment, I've got I've just finished 3 novels that the protagonist in it is a knife guy. One's called The Carroll Factor, and the other one's called Vengeance Creek. And the hero in it is buys and sells knives and guns and things like that, and that's available on Amazon and most book outlets, Barnes and Noble. Unfortunately, it's not hit the New York Times bestseller list, and I don't think that it's going to. But I enjoyed writing. I'm doing a column in my local country weekly every other week. I'm doing 2 columns a month in Knife Magazine. Plus, I'm running an auction business. And this is because my dad taught me to do it that way. When I was 16 years old, I've got a grandson that just turned 16, so this is why this is in my mind. When I was 16 years old, I was playing in a band. And, we were doing gigs when people hired us. But at 16, it popped into my head, well, this location over here that's rentable, why don't I rent it and let's put on our own gig there? And we did. So I was promoting dances at 16. And there was a lot I learned in that helped me when we started promoting knife shows. And every one of these, I promoted the Blade Show, and I also handled it for the Knife Makers Guild on various times, and then shows of the Spirit of Steel shows and things that we still do now twice a year in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. It's so yeah, I left the shows out on the other things I'm doing. So it's just, but the nice thing about it, most of this relates back to knives for me. It always circles back.
Yeah. Well, and um, kind of summarizing the way that I think of where we've gone so far is I think that there's a difference between benevolence and malevolence, right? In either case, one hand washes the other, or a parasite is just gracious enough to its host that it doesn't kill it so it can walk around, right? And I think that there's 2 different types of people, right? You either are a parasite, or you are, hygienic and you wash the other hand, right? And uh, I've always found, based on the context at which I've understood your work, that you're the one hand washes the other. That what's good for the goose is good for the gander. That there's a symbiosis that's required in order to have people accept that something is good for them, and then you basically have to convince them that it is good for you, like, or good for them.
Well, I've always figured we're all in this together. And if I help somebody sell more knives, then they're going to have more money to buy ads in the publications I was producing, or they're going to have more money to go to shows. And it's like Tony Bowes. Tony Bowes would have drawings for his knives, and I told him one time, I said, Tony, you're selling these knives for $1,500, and you're watching the guy turn around and sell it for 2,000 right behind you. He said, yeah, well, I like to leave a little room in it for people. And so I said, well, why don't you get some for yourself sometime? You make a knife for me, and I'll put it in auction, and I'll just worry about the buyer's premium, and you can keep all of it. I won't even charge you a percentage. And you don't even have to put out a card or go to a show or nothing. If you want to do one of these in auction, I'm good with this. And so his knives, he was selling his knives at his drawings at the Blade Show for $2,000, something like that. He made an ivory handle back when it was legal, a 2-blade bullet style trapper. I put it, and I think we got $5,000 off it for it. Gave him the 5,000. I said, make me another. He said, well, okay, when I get around to it. Never did. But he always left a room in it for somebody. Uh, when I first started trading knives, I went to this little knife trade on the courthouse square in Lawrenceville, Georgia. And when I first started, a case canoe sold for $8.20, wholesale for $4.10. You could go to Downtown Supply on the square in Lawrenceville, and if he knew you, you could buy those knives at about 40 off. And if they had really pretty bone handles, you could take them to a knife show and sell them for $15. I heard one guy brag, I may have paid $20 for it, but I got the nicest knife in the room. At that point, I mean, bear in mind, retail on this knife was $8.10. And all of the case knives at this time were doing this because demand had increased what they could produce in their small factory. This was before they built the South Bradford plant in 1976. So you had high demand, you had the prices. Within 2 years, that same canoe that had been selling for $4.10 was now $25 retail, so for $12.50. So you could still sell it for $15, but your profit down was less because somebody at Case had noticed the aftermarket value and they took up all of that market and cut out tons of middlemen. And and some of the factories have done this too. They get some new sales manager in, and he said, "Oh, these distributors that are buying 50 less 25 are ruining our business. We just need to cut them off and just go 40% off." And so then they go 40% off. They can't understand why their business slows down. And that's some of these companies have gone out of business playing games like that. You know, the the way Bill Adams says it. Bill Adams is a very astute friend of mine who used to own Atlanta Cutlery. He said that people put grooves in their heads on the way they think, the way they like to do something, the way they like to go to a show and come in that entrance, blah, blah, blah. And he said, when you try to put new grooves in somebody's head, it's very difficult. And it's generally going to affect you. When you move a show location, not everybody travels with you. A show in a new location or a brand new knife show somewhere, the core group will come and say, we're going to help you establish this. It's not that we're going to come here and make money this first year. First couple of years on a show anywhere are very tough. And if you don't have a big client list, they're even tougher.
Yeah. I do want to circle back where we left off on Blade Show and everything, but in a kind of a different avenue because I know that you've covered kind of the progression of how that came to be. So my understanding from what we've talked about previously and everything is that Jim Parker and you had founded Blade Show and Blade Magazine effectively, right? And that he was a majority shareholder and you were just barely majority, right? So it's like some 60-40 split or something like that.
Well, I ran it, and he was basically a financial investor, but he was also one of the most astute businessmen I've ever known, and basically a genius. When I went to when his father-in-law died, I went to the funeral home, and he introduced me to one of his teachers that had retired after 50 years in teaching. And I asked her, I said, "Was Jim the smartest person you ever taught?" And she said, "Well, no, there was one girl that was smarter than him, and she's a librarian. But of all the people I taught in 50 years of teaching, he's the smartest boy I ever taught." And so uh, at one point, when we first started the Blade Show, bear in mind, we were in head-to-head competition with the National Knife Collectors Association. He was a former president. They had ousted him politically. They had basically told me they were printing at my printer friend that I would go to lunch with was printing National Knife Collector magazine. And he told me 3 months in advance, and Bruce, you better be looking for a job because when they open the museum in May and have that meeting, they're going to fire you because they've already been asking me to give them a referral to somebody who could edit a magazine. And so this was a tough situation. Jim Parker said at the time, "Well, I know one thing, they can't out advertise us." They can't outspend us because he took this personal and he was gonna make it work. So the way the agreement was, I designed Jim's catalogs using our equipment, and I did all of the editing, publication, and all that. And basically, he just oversaw the money, but he was very astute at that. So that was a very, very good workable combination. But I bought his shares out and was a sole owner around 1986. And that's about the time we went on national newsstands. And that was a big, big bump in things, too. At that time, we had done, I think the Blade Show started in 82. So we had only done 3 Blade shows. And basically, I did all the management on all of those. So Jim was, it couldn't have been done without him. But basically, he was too busy selling knives to meddle around with the publication end of it.
Sure.
But
well, yeah, I mean, one hand washes the other, right?
Well, I can. Well, it's like this. When we bought the magazine, we bought Blade magazine at the time for $65,000. We borrowed another 30 for operating expenses, and Jim co-signed my note for 40% of it. He put in 60%. As far as for the purchase price, and then, like I say, we borrowed that money and paid that back to each other. So when I bought him out in 1986, this is only 5 years later, you must understand, I paid him $275,000. So he was well happy with his investment. And I was too, because all I ever did was run magazines. And then when I sold it in 1994, I'll just say it was substantially higher. Leave it at that. But I was well pleased with my investment too.
Yeah.
But we'd worked our asses off to do it. The first issue of American or Blade magazine under my ownership, and with Parker as a partner, I worked 30 hours straight. I did all the layout, the paste up, and all that. And it was a 100-page magazine. It'd been being like a 50, 60-page magazine. And I did it all. We had a typesetter, but we were using that old CompuGraphic stuff where you had to print out a page and paste it down. You had to wax the back of it and roll it down. If it was crooked, you had to straighten it up. It was tedious. And that's the most I've ever worked at one time without stopping, but it's 30 straight hours. And about 4 o'clock the next day, we were on a deadline. And about 4 o'clock the next day, I said, I'm going to go in my office and crank out my chair, and I'm going to rest for about a half an hour. You all wake me up. And half an hour later, I couldn't move. It was just, that was, I know what my limit is at that age, when it's 30 hours. But, one thing we didn't get into is Jim and I did not start. It was started by Blackie Collins and John Cullors. Then Blackie Collins owned it. Then Jack Maravich, a dentist in New Orleans, bought it. Then Wally Beinfeld did it, and we bought it from Wally Beinfeld. And that was from, say, 1972 to 81. 1972 is when it was founded as American Blade Magazine. We bought it in 1981. Now, Jim Parker came to me one day and said, look, I've got one of the Japanese suppliers that bought me 2 first-class tickets, or a first-class ticket, and one of the other companies bought me 2 second-class tickets. How would you like to go to Japan for free and tour the Japanese knife industry? And you could write about it in the magazine. I said, hallelujah, put me down. So for 2 weeks, we went to Japan, and I wrote up the Japanese knife industry. We did a special issue of the magazine on it, and I even did slideshows at some of the regional clubs about our trip there. But when I went to with Parker to Japan, and the first morning there, we're sitting at breakfast, and in walks this big tall guy who's Bob Ernst. He's the sales manager of Schrade. And Schrade at that time was our biggest advertiser. And in those days, we sold covers, and Schrade bought the covers 6 at a time. So dropped serious money. I mean, a huge part of our ad budget. Ernst sits down, and I said, "What are you doing here?" He looks over at Parker and says, "Do you want to tell him? You want me to tell him?" I said, "I'm just kind of confused." And Jim said, "You tell him." He said, "Well, we're over here to start a new company that is going to take over the American hardware industry because all these knife importers and stuff, nobody's going after the hardware industry. We're going after the hardware industry, and I'm going to be a partner in it, and we're going to take over. We're going to knock off all the patterns, etc." And I said, "Well, what are you going to name the company?" He said, "American Blade Cutler." And I went berserk. I said, "You cannot do that because it will confuse people with American Blade magazine, and the magazine is what I do, and no, we can't do this." And Parker said, "Well, Bruce, let's put it like this. We're holding a stockholders meeting, and my 60% vote that we're going to use American Blade cutlery, use the eagle and the name American Blade for this cutlery company, and we will pay a royalty for it to the American Blade Incorporated. But my 60% votes we do this. I assume your 40% votes no. We have the motion. The motion carries." So I got a very important lesson on being a minority stockholder. And I was in a quandary because what on earth are we going to do? Because I couldn't stop. So the one thing we did do is we took American off of it and just called it Blade Magazine from that point. So we could differentiate between that and American Blade Cutlery. And I was whining about it. And Parker just said, "Bruce, I bought this company just to get used to that eagle." He said, "I could shut the magazine down and it wouldn't bother me a bit. I bought it to get used to that eagle. I didn't buy it to have a magazine." And so that's when Blade Magazine was born. So before we got back, word had reached Schrade that Bob Ernst was in Japan creating a new knife factory. So when he arrived, they went back to work at Schrade. He was on his vacation, went back to work at Schrade. They walked him right into a room, handed him a non-compete agreement, non-disclosure agreement. "So you sign this now or you're fired." And he said, "Okay, I'm fired," and walked out the door. Schrade, so Albert Bear and Henry Bear, he was their number one boy. I mean, they trusted him and thought a lot of him, and all of a sudden he had betrayed them in their opinion. And therefore anybody associated with him was thus betrayed. And if there was an American Blade Cutlery Company and they were advertising American Blade Magazine, we can fix this. We're never going to advertise American Blade Magazine again. So in one fell swoop, I lost my biggest advertiser by, I'm talking about probably 30% of our ad budget.
Wow.
This was almost a deal killer. This could have been the end very easily. But realizing that, we started digging in. We started calling people a little bit harder. We got a little more aggressive in our ad sales. We went other areas that maybe people hadn't thought about advertising in our knife magazine, and we hung on. But it was a very important lesson for me because after that, I never let a big customer or a big advertiser try to tell me how to run my business, because I knew if I could survive that, I could survive anything. I mean, we recently had one of our good customers, and he said, I've started going to bed early, and so I can't stay up to the end of your auctions, and I like to throw my bids in at the last minute, and I need you to back your auctions up, start closing them earlier. I said, "I can't do that." I said, "There are people on the West Coast that want to bid in our auctions." I said, "I learned this much when I was selling knives on television at Shop at Home. I said, we sold knives till 2 a.m. because we wanted that West Coast market. I said, so we start closing at 10:30, and that's just the way we do it. He said, well, I can't. If you do, I'm not going to bid in your auctions anymore. Okay, see ya. And that all went back to that thing with Schrade. If you want to do business with me, if you want to do business with me and be my friend, I'm one of the friendliest people you'll ever meet. If you want to go to war with me, it's time to start shooting at each other. Wally Byfield told me when we were buying the magazine, his quote was, and he had a very soft voice. He said, I've never harmed a fly, but I've slowly pulled the wings off every wasp that's ever stung. Now, now I'm not quite that vindictive. I wouldn't pull them slow. I just jerk them off.
Yeah, I've been kicked when I've been down a lot, and the thing that I really detest in life is when I feel somebody's boot on my neck. It just makes me want to be ravenous. So I've always thought that if I ever think that there's a possibility that your boot is on my neck, then I will keep you in a certain place, and I will trust you only as much as I have to.
Well, you may have seen that meme that shows two boys fighting and says, if it comes to the point that you have to fight, think like you're the third monkey getting onto Noah's Ark, and brother, it's starting to rain.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's probably a perspective that I've gained through corporate America, because the reality is like people throw out the fact that they're sharks, but as a way to, like, I guess, pump up a bravado and ego and everything. But one thing that I've learned in corporate America is that, man, there are a lot of sharks in the ocean. And if you're either the biggest or the most vicious, and it is really a dog eat dog type of world in there. And um, I've taken the mentality over the years. It's like, if you're not willing to burn down the bridge or topple the columns like Samson for what you believe in, then how much are you really in it?
Well, I had a good friend of mine that later became a credit manager for one of the largest companies in America. And he came in one day with a very nice suit on. And I came in, I said, man, that's a real nice suit. He said, yes, I'm going to foreclose on the orphanage. And that was his mentality toward things. Um, so it's a crazy world. The one thing I've told my kids and try to keep constant myself is, don't worry or don't pay attention to what people say. Pay attention to what they do and what they've done. And that's generally a pretty good indicator. Their actions speak whole lot better than their words. A lot of people tell you anything, sort of like that Jimmy Buffett line about, I've read lots of books of heroes and crooks and learned much from both of their styles. And so, it doesn't hurt to understand how a crook is, but it's sort of like lying. And my memory's not good enough to lie because I can't remember what I said, especially at my age. And so, if you tell the truth, you don't have to wonder about what you said. And I think that's one of the things when we're talking to people that's a potential consignor to our auctions, uh, is I'm talking sincerely, and I think it comes across that way. I don't lie or evade or oversell. I just tell them the way it is, and what they can expect, what they can't expect. And we're not miracle workers. We can't take a $5,000 knife and get $100,000 for it. But we can take a $5,000 knife and get $5,000 or $6,000 for it. And on a bad day, we'll get 4,000.
Yeah. I've used it in business before, but I refer to it as the Missouri rule. If like I'm a show me guy, right? So the show me state, like if I can't see that you're actually practicing what you preach, then I am like genuinely distrustful. Probably from being beat as a kid, like, physically abused. I just have never really trusted anybody fully. But I'm kind of that way. Like you will gain a lot more respect from me if I see the way that you act in process or in progress than if you just tell me something and blow a lot of smoke. And I've used that as a business principle and really just a life principle. Like all my kids know that's like you can say sorry to me all day long. I love you. Like I'm giving you grace here, but the reality is that I need you to show me that you're sorry, not just say it to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm interested with everything that happened with Schrade and this process. Um, where exactly did the parallels run with the Knife Makers Guild? Because you talked about Blackie Collins, which I actually have a book that he wrote on repairing pocket knives. I think it was sometime in the early '70s he wrote it. But where did the relationship with the guild exactly come from, or was that just a natural progression of the kind of circles that you were in and the inroads that you were making?
Well, uh, oh, first you have to keep in mind Blackie Collins was a genius. Probably had more knife patents in his name than just about anybody except George Schrade. Certainly George Schrade of our generation. Uh, you know, Gerber, uh, Pete tried to. Pete even bought Benchmark Knife Company out of Gastonia, North Carolina, because they had part of Blackie's patents and rights, and he bought it just to keep control of Blackie's creative talents. Of course, Blackie, he's going right now and doing somebody else. And he was he told me, he said he had a mail slot, old mail slot thing in his office, and every slot had a different idea he had been working on for knife patents. And one time at one of the guild shows, he had a guy come in, and I saw him hand him a check for like $20,000 for the original prototype for one of those Gerber patent knives. Had to take a picture of it with him. But Blackie started Blade or America Blade. When I say Blade, I'm speaking it interchangeably with America Blade in the early days. Blackie and John Cullors started it. John Cullors later go on to edit Outdoor Life. And then they started Sporting Classics. I think he was involved in that at one time. Great magazines. And Blackie did that. And at that time, you're thinking about 1972, I think. Blade, or 74, 74. That's all there was you had American Blade magazine, you had the Knife Makers Guild that was organized to serve as a place to set up a certain board of standards, in that you're not going to screw somebody over a knife. Because what had happened earlier prior to that is there were a lot of guys when this knife making thing started good. A lot of the guys were doing it, and they would take advance money and they would spend money. And then by the time it came to deliver the knife, they didn't have enough money to even buy the supplies. And they were made great knives, but they weren't good businessmen, and they spent money that should have like been in an escrow account or something. And it was so prevalent that there were people talking back and forth about can't buy any knives anymore because nobody will send me a knife. Everybody's just stealing my money. And so they created the guild. A.G. Russell rented a block of tables at the Houston Gun Show. At that time, the Houston Gun Show had 5 miles of aisle space. And A.G. put all of those tables together, and I think he had 13 or 14 people, Chubby Husky and G.W. Stone and a whole bunch of the early guys. And the reason a lot of them were in Texas because this is where the show was. And they agreed that they'd start the Knife Makers Guild, just basically to have a set of standards that if you're in the guild, they're going to police you being honest. And if you're not, they're going to kick you out of the guild. So very soon there was nothing but the Knife Makers Guild. And pretty soon, as word of this got out, If you weren't a Knife Makers Guild member, nobody buy a knife from you. At least very few people. There were people would only buy from Knife Makers Guild members. And they had a set of standards. You had to go through a probationary period. Then you had became a voting member. And so Lovelace was instrumental in getting all of that started because he had the vision to see what was going to come if they didn't do it. And he became a president. Then Bill Moran became a president of it. And these two guys were totally opposite. One was wanted spend and everything, and the other one, Bill, was more tightly conservative, and he resented paying taxes. Period. And he wanted to take the guild tax exempt, which was going to be a difficult thing. And so they argued over that. Next year they had somebody else, and so it evolved that way. But the guild became the only game in town if you were a knife maker, and it meant something. I mean, it really did. If you were a Knife Makers Guild member and you walked into a gun show, you had some awe factor there. But and they didn't just promote themselves; they promoted the makers, and the writers of the time that were writing in outdoor magazines. You had Burt Miller and John Sundra and some of these and B.R. Hughes. They're writing in these major publications, gun publications primarily. And the first thing they say, he's a Knife Makers Guild member. He's a Knife Makers Guild member. He's a Knife Makers Guild member. You were conspicuous in your absence if you were not a Knife Makers Guild member. And then as things evolved, all of a sudden, you had the ABS on one hand, and all of a sudden, with the coming of the internet, you didn't have to be a member of the guild to sell knives. There was a time you did. So it made a huge difference. And I think the guild's impact has decreased a lot when they got in the arguments over the machine parts things. A lot of it is when of the top shakers and movers that were men of vision, like Frank Centofanti, he passed away. That was a huge gap in the business. His death left a hole in the business. That's the only way to say it for handmade knives. And because he was an excellent manager, and some of the other guys, when you're putting somebody in charge because they make a great knife, doesn't mean they have a great business sense. There's two different animals. But if the criteria is making a good knife, making a good knife doesn't make you a good manager. And that's part of the issue now, I think, with the guild. But even now, the once one show, if you went to one show a year was the guild show, now it's the Blade show. And now Blade has, if I'm not mistaken, Blade has now merged to a Texas show, in which is now considered the guild show and the ABS show.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask questions on like show rights and venues and things like that in a minute. But for clarification's sake, the guild, as it stands today, owns no rights to any shows, right? And the Blade, Texas venue was previously ICCE, which was run by Jerry Moen, which was previously, I believe, the Kansas City show, if I remember correctly. Which was, if I remember the lineage of things, that was a combination of the guild show and ABS show. But what so the guild doesn't actually have an official show at all. We have presence at other shows, like venues, but the only thing that as a guild that we have is meetings that correspond with shows. Last year it was at Texas and at Atlanta, so we'd had two for the year. That was to accommodate growth and expansion and whatnot. But from sometimes from year to year and voting body to voting body, that'll change a little bit. What do you remember exactly when the transition occurred with the guild not actually having that Atlanta venue? Was that something under your purview, or after you had already sold the magazine?
Well, to best of my knowledge, the guild never had an Atlanta venue. It started, we had a special section for the Knife Makers Guild members, and we hung a sign over it that this is where the guild members are. And we did the same thing for the ABS. And the ABS was basically using the Blade Show as their annual show because that's where they're doing all the testing and things. And then they expanded that uh, later on, much later, after I'd sold it. So some of that I basically don't know enough about to be commenting on, to be quite honest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's okay. I think the point to be made is that a lot of people in the general public associate the guild now with a kind of defunct organization, and I'm just mirroring what I hear from people who are collecting knives and talk about getting into the politics, I guess, of knife shows and makers and things like that. Right? It's not the guild has its politics, but I'm talking about the customers and their perception of things. Right? Um, there's a general distrust now in the industry of the knife makers guild because of the politics that have happened within the last 20-ish years. And so as a result of that, whenever somebody hears the guild, there's one of two things that happens. Either they understand the pomp and circumstance of the guild, or they eye roll because the politics are the things that have shined through. And that's not really where the knife makers and general populace converge, is that that's pretty much bifurcated amongst those two types of opinions. It's either you respect the guild because of what it's been, or you disrespect or don't acknowledge the relevance of the guild because it's just a bunch of infighting and boys club type of mentality.
Well, the one thing going back to me, that the end the or the not the end the decline began when they argued over the machine parts, because at that time the two hottest knife makers in the country were Bob Trezzola and Ernie Emerson. They were selling everything they made, and people would drive halfway across the country to get a chance to buy a knife that they were selling. And if you recall what we mentioned earlier, that when I was was helping manage the Knife Makers Guild, the first thing I did was I polled all the honorary members on what are you looking for when you come to a knife show? Why do you come to a knife show? And almost in the unanimous or almost unanimous one thing was they wanted to come to see these top makers and to hang out with them and talk to them and visit with them. And the Knife Makers Guild itself, I don't think they ever grasped that the guild show was famous because it was a fabulous celebration of handmade knives once a year. And when you went there, you saw everybody. What I'm saying is all the top makers. If you wanted a list of your top 10 makers, they were all at the guild show, and they were all guild members, and they were all running the guild. And so, I mean, you're talking about officers that were this officers in the guild were Ron Lake, Frank Centofanti, Dee Holder, Buster Warinsky, George Heron, Jimmy Lyle, Bob Lovelace, William Moran. I mean, think about these guys and their stature now. If they were still alive and went to one show a year, it was the one you'd have to go to. And when they did the machined parts thing, first thing happened was Bob T said, I'll come back when it's okay. I'm not here to fight with anybody. This is the way, these are the two parts that I have machined. And if that's an issue with you, don't buy the knife. And he put it out there. He's totally honest with it. And they left. And so Ernie quit coming. Bob T quit coming. And your draw went away. The thing that, the in the auction business, the knives that I want up front is I want a knife in there that where somebody's going to look at that knife, pick up their phone, and call their best knife buddy and say, "Are you believing this knife that Bruce has in that auction?" And they pick up the phone and they call other people. And the best knife shows was when look who all's going to be there. I've got to go to that show. And if they are name makers, then yes, that's good. But if they're average makers that you've never heard of, even though they're all in a group, you need the stars, I guess is what I'm saying. And the stars left the guild or faded away from the guild. And part of the reason was that the guild membership at one time was very expensive, and the tables at the show were very expensive, and it was very hard to make money at that show. But if it was the only game in town, you had to go because you had to be seen there. Now you've got other places that you can be seen. As close as going to your computer and showing them a knife you've been working on for a week. You got some makers now that are showing you the knives they're going to have available at the show, and they're showing them in production. And the people that want to buy these knives are lining up for them. And so, the guild show, times have changed since the guild show was what it was. I would love to see the guild show back the way it was.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the thing that made the guild show special for me, a lot of those guys, a lot of those legends have passed on. And it's sort of like that George Jones song about who's going to fill their shoes. I went into one of those tactical knife invitationals, and Bob Trezola came up and he looks at me and I looked at him. I said, "Is it just us, or we don't know anybody in here?" So, that market's kind of moved beyond us. That's me, because, I don't have a magazine where I have to keep up with it anymore. So I'm not as in tune with that whole world and its changing as I used to be. And so, but we have a thing now. It's almost like some of these guys become what I call internet famous. They're a flash in the pan. They're getting big money for their knives, and then 6 months later, nobody's ever heard of them again because it wasn't what they thought it was. The 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 best way I can say it is, I write because I like to write. I collect knives because I like knives. The best knife makers are the one that if they were not getting paid would still go out there in the shop and make a knife. It's just I had a friend of mine that knew Jerry Reed, and Jerry Reed, he was contemporary of Chet Atkins. They played together. Chet Atkins gave him a certified guitar picker designation. He only gave that to like 5 people. And he said he sat there with Jerry Reed in his living room, and Jerry Reed was sitting there watching television, and he had a Fender Telecaster he's playing the whole time. That's a solid body guitar, so it doesn't make a lot of racket. But he was playing while he's watching television, and he is a master. He is good enough to sit and play with Chet Atkins, and he's playing his guitar in his living room, and said if he walked into the kitchen to get a drink of water, he carried the guitar and he played it all the way in there. And to be a star knife maker, you have to have that kind of dedication, and you have to want to make it that bad. And it's almost like some of these guys, it's too easy now. You can watch videos, you can go to some guy's shop that's been on television and pay him a little bit, and all of a sudden you're walking out of there making knives. I went to the ABS school at one time when I owned Blade. We gave the ABS a $500 a year scholarship to pay for somebody to go to the ABS knife making school that wouldn't normally get together to do it. So as part of that, they said, "Well, since you've done that, you can come anytime you want to." So I said, "Okay, I'm coming." So I went down to Hope, Arkansas. It's 112 degrees, beating on hot steel in a forge. And all I can say is the knife I made proudly would pass a journeyman smith test if I wanted to make knives for two more years before I could get my journeyman smith stamp. And I can also tell you nobody's ever going to see that knife because it's pretty bad. So, but it's something else I do because I like knives. And I think that you can. I think if you put one motivation on me being in the knife business and all of these different things I've done, it's because I like knives. Writing books, editing magazines, putting on shows, buying and selling, auctioning. I'm still knives is central core of that. Still like them.
Yeah. I I was talking to a local knife maker here. I had him on the podcast, and we were talking about the fact that we get bored easy, and I pretty much everything that I've ever done in my life, I've been able to figure out pretty quickly. Is it a scheme or is it a salvation or what is it? Discernment is like kind of my thing. And uh it doesn't take me a long time to figure out kind of what's what. And knives has been that one thing that I've just always found that it touches something else or can touch something else in a way that always renews my passion for it. I could, not actually make a knife. Like I work in IT. I don't always have the most time in the shop, but I have the podcast that I do. If I'm sitting on a computer, I can also be working on something on the podcast. If I'm doing something where I don't have access to technology, I can be scratching something with Scrimshaw, researching something. I can be reading a book on knives or whatever. There's so much to it that to me it just constantly drives this passion for wanting to create or dream about creating or what it does when we get people together that love to create. And it to me it's unending, like it's a non-exhaustible flame, and there's really very little that gets in the way of knives. Like my wife told me recently that I just talk so much about it. And the common culture with knives, and how the guild is relevant and things like that, well, and how shows are, is that um, social media is very quickly deplatforming anything that is weapon or gun adjacent, right? And knives are one of those things. It doesn't matter whether it's cutlery or not, really. Even payment processors won't work with you if you have um, uh, a website that you're running transactions through, and they find out that it has anything to do with knives. And my question is what's going to happen when that dries up? All these people that have been selling on Facebook for forever, or Instagram, or wherever, right? It used to be Blade Forums was the place to go on the internet because it was not associated with the politics of anything other than knives. But everybody who's like based their business off of social media and invested their time in building like a customer and collector market on social media is going to find very quickly that that's not going to work anymore. And then where are they going to resolve that need for business and attention? They either have shows and publications and organizations that help promote them, or they're really not going to ever be seen. And that's really going to separate the wheat from the chaff in the industry.
Well, you've got to keep in mind that the knife show and the knife market was very strong and very good before there was such a thing as the internet. And what would, and in the scenario that you talk about, if everybody quits using Facebook, well, put it like this: Facebook's easy. You buy a bunch of knives, you pick a time you're going to do your little live feed, and they call you and they send you messages, and you sell these knives. And the thing I've noticed primarily, which drives me crazy, is they call these auctions, but now they call them auctions because the state auction boards that are, these licensing groups are coming after them. So they say they have to say be a timed sale. So they'll put a little timer in the back. Half the time you don't even see the timer turned on. And then they still auction them. And then at the end of the auction, the guy says, "Oh yeah." I said, "Well, no, my top bid on this is 250, and I can't sell it for that, Bob. But Bob, if you'll go another $50, I'll sell it to you, and I won't let anybody else have it because you ended up being the high bidder." That's not how an auction works. And some of these guys, are still doing business with people that do that and tolerate it. Okay, that's free market. You can do what you want to. But if all of that collapses, then it has to go back to the people that are willing to do the work. Now, what that means is when I started in knife collecting, the early days, early 70s, um, um, of what a guy would do would have a direct mail mailing list, and he would trace the outline of the knives because nobody had any books or anything else. So you trace the outline of the knife and put about 4 of those on a page. You turn the page over, and you mailed like an 8-page list. Maybe had 8 times 40, maybe 30, 40 knives on it. Then when Jim Parker started, the primary thing was Jim Parker and W.E. Shockley, among others. But those were the two big guys when knife collecting started, that if you wanted to buy knives once a month, you could get this list in the mail from them. And they had been buying for a month, and all they did was write out the description. You didn't have pictures. You didn't have color pictures. You didn't have front and backside pictures. You relied totally on that man's ability to write the description. Jim Parker, W. Shockey. That's why you paid attention to those grading standards that the NKCA set up in these books, because you knew the difference. If they said this is an excellent knife versus a very good knife versus a near mint knife, you understood. You also, there by force, had to learn the case numbering system, because all they would do, they didn't write a case trap. They put 6254 10 dot $20, and boom, there it was. That's all they had to do. You would see these generally try to do it to keep it in one envelope, so you get 4 pages front and back to fit in a number 10 business envelope, or they do 3 pages legal size. But those two guys were the leaders. I did a list. Paul Davis did a list. There were Jorgen Nielsenmeyer out of Cleveland, Ohio, did a list. You could count on your hands the people that did these knife lists, and we were doing them direct mail by mail order. Facebook goes down, and the banks quit doing it, and they ban knives, which is an idiotic thing, in my opinion, to start with. If they do that, then what we'll be doing is we'll be emailing each other and building an email list. And once a month, just like I do catalogs now, I put them on the website. We handle the transaction personally. That could just as easily go on an email with color pictures inset into that. They're not going to blow up full screen, but they're going to be there. So it'll just change. Before people started putting them on the internet, they were buying and selling knives very well. So I think a lot of people put too much faith in Facebook and social media, because this is somewhat of a new thing. I've got one rule, the Voyles rule of the knife business is that people go out of the knife business at the same speed they came into the knife business. So some guy that you never heard of last week, and all of a sudden he's everywhere you look, and he's in all the magazines and all that, and he's done this in 2 months, and he's on everybody's Facebook page and all that, and he'll be gone the same length of time. You look up one day and he'll be gone. The same way with all these Facebook dealers. You got boom, boom, boom. They've created this market. And it was very good when there were only 2 guys in it. Now, on any given night, you can go on Facebook and get through these groups, and you can find somebody doing some kind of sale online, and they're all competing against each other now. And now is when it gets nasty. But let me go back to something you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the Knife Makers Guild and some of the things that may have happened to it that made it lose its prominence. And this is one of the rules that I live by, is that you're okay doing business. The problems start when you start worrying about what the other guy's doing in his business, especially in knives. If you make the best knife you can, if you're personable to your customers, if you run your business like a business, what the fella 2 tables down from you is doing doesn't matter. And you shouldn't be worrying about it or thinking about it. You should be selling your product. But invariably, in those days especially, the knife makers weren't worrying about the knives they made. They were worrying about the guy down the road, down the aisle, using a machine part or something. And at that time, when this controversy was going on, the Knife Makers Guild paid me and a film crew to go to interview Bob Lovis in California about what was the original designation of the guild when it started, so they could play it at the guild show that year. So I went out there with a film crew, went to visit Lovelace, and Lovelace, when he had been visiting me, he kept talking about this guy came in and drank my liquor and did this, and drank my whiskey and did this. So before I left, I called somebody, called some mutual friends, and what kind of liquor does he like? Oh, he likes Jack Daniels. So before we went there, Dan Delavan went with me. Delavan went to probably the first time Dan ever been in a liquor store in his life. Went into a liquor store and bought me a handle of Gentleman Jack. And so when we went to the gate, Bob let us in. I had it behind my back, and I said, I wanted to bring you a gift. I hope you appreciate the gift and the spirit in which it is given. And I handed him that handle of Gentleman Jack. He's took it in and set it up. But so then we started talking about it. And what he said is very profound, particularly on all of these things. He said, I wish that I had a machine where I could throw in some steel, throw in some handle material, throw in some pins, punch a button, and it come out fully boxed and addressed to send to somebody. He said, but it doesn't work like that. He said, here's my advice to knife makers. Make your knife any way you want to. The marketplace will sort you out soon enough. And that's the message we took back to the knife makers. And they played it on a loop that entire show. And Frank Centofanti, as we were going in, and the controversies were going every which way, he looks at me and says, this organization has no loyalty anymore. And that's when I knew the decline had started.
Yeah, what year about was that?
Good question. Prior to 2000, as I recall, because I don't think I'd started auctioning yet, and I wasn't working in a magazine. There's a 5-year period there. Yeah. So prior to 2000, 90s, some point. I could be off on that.
And I think that's something that people have to understand too, is that we're really talking about artists who their ego to some extent is intrinsic to their product, right? And it's difficult to differentiate that. An example is I've heard that a lot of the guild politics had to do with members in the guild wanted a knife maker, if they were in the guild, to have skin in the game, and anything that disrupted the full-time knife maker's ability to make their living and everything, whether it was decisions on what they accepted as viable products, or where the machining came from, or things like that, anything that affected the marketability of their knives because of the guild reputation, that they were averse to it. And some of the politics, like it seems like there's not just one element of failure that happened because that brought the guild's reputation, or the dissemination of makers outside of the guild and doing their own thing, but it's a lot of that ego that affected the guild as a result. Like the entity of the guild, it was a summation of a lot of ego-driven decisions.
Well, I think the best way you can say that is times changed and people changed, and the guild didn't change with it.
Yeah, I think that's very fair.
Which means that could all be regained. The guild's not the guild is not as prominent as it was because there's other entities out there, and the guild is not required membership as it once was, but there's still plenty it can do. Going back to what Ron Lake said, be an organization, you got to do great things. You have to do great things. That means you do things that are good for everybody and they get noticed. And there's Lovelace said, you can't keep your light under a bushel. You have to let people know what you're doing. Can't keep it a secret.
Yeah, I think all those are very fair. I wanted to touch a little bit on your involvement in this thing that we now know as blade sports, because part of what I think we need to do is make some inroads with what the modern knife collector enthusiast sees, like the blade sports and forged and fire culture, and what you originally did in pioneering these things and documenting it all inside of the books and magazines and things, like all the analog ephemera, if that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about like kind of how all that started with relation to blade sports?
Well, I don't know anything about blade sports. I can tell you how cutting competitions start. And first of all, the cutting competition started with things like the Journeyman Smith test and doing it publicly. And then probably Jerry Fisk is the father of the whole thing, because the first time I saw it was we went to a Batson hammer in near Bessemer, Alabama. There was a forge there that was a cannon forge during the Civil War, and they made a state park out of it. And so once a year they have a big blacksmith hand forged council meeting there. It's primarily a blacksmith council more than knife making, but it became into a knife making thing with all sorts of demonstrations and different speakers. And I've spoken there before. And Jim Batson was the primary organizer of it. He's former president of the ABS and a rocket scientist from the Redstone Arsenal. He was instrumental in the 2.75 rockets that they used on helicopters in Vietnam. That's pretty well his project. Brilliant man, doctor. And he's also one hell of a promoter. And he's written books on knives too, especially on Jim Bowie. And he put this thing together. And Jerry Fisk was down there, and he got all these ABS members. And they had these certain competitions. They were how deep you could cut through a phone book, how quick you could cut a ping pong ball in half. And 5 or 6 of these various tasks that everybody did, and then they declared a winner at the end of it. And that bulb kind of went off in my head. And then I went to, then we invited Fisk and the ABS to do the same thing at the Spirit of Steel show. Now, prior to that, we had gone when they opened the ABS knife school in Hope, Arkansas. We had gone down there and watched in the school itself where Bill Moran and Jimmy Kroll, they did little seminars, and then we walked out and watched Bill build a fire and watched Moran forge a knife. And so we asked Bill, who was my adopted daddy. He adopted me one day for a day. I'll tell you about that later if you want to hear it. But Bill would come, they'd set up a forge, and he would go out, he would do demonstrations, and he would talk about it. He's a great teacher. And it became a major turning point in the blade show when we started having these forging demonstrations. So but when we invited them, it was Bill Moran came in and did this. This wasn't just anybody forging. This was Bill, by God, Moran. And so he would do the forging demonstration. So I was always looking to make it different. One of the major goals in the blade show when we started is I didn't want it to be just a knife show. I wanted it to be an event. And that's what I beat over everybody's heads in the office when we would talk about it. We want to make it an event. We went so far as when we first or second blade show we ever did, we had a room near the blade show where we showed on a constant loop the Iron Mistress starring Alan Ladd. We got permission from Turner to do it. And among the people, Gil Hibben, his favorite movie, he took time for the show to go in there and watch it again. So we were always trying to do more. So we did a cutting competition, and when we moved the show to Texas, Spirit of Steel show, we asked them to come down and set up and do a cutting demonstration. They did a forging demonstration, then they also did a cutting competition. And from that, I thought, in my mind, I said, well, we could make this bigger, because I saw the crowd reaction. The crowd reaction is what really lit me up, because everybody was interested in watching this. And so we went to sat down with a couple of people. There was a guy that was a real good ad salesman for that had left Blade. He was loose and free, looking for work, and I was looking for something extra to add to a show. So we decided we would start the international cutting competition trail, ICCT, and we wrote the name out in a rope. Was how it was written out. And we decided we'd set up these cutting competitions. I didn't want to step on anybody's toes. So I went to Jerry Fisk and B.R. Hughes, and I said, look, this is what I think I want to do. I want you to run it. I said, what we want to do is we're going to set up, not the custom makers are going to have competitions, but then we're going to set this up for knives that they design. And we will go to manufacturers and have these manufacturers make these knives based on their designs. And then we'll even have an amateur division. We'll call it the red, white, and blue divisions. And what we'll be doing, it'll be looking like these lumberjack competitions. And we're going to make celebrities out of these top cutters. And because of that, you're going to have people wanting a knife like that cutter. They're going to be selling like crazy. Factories going to be making more knives. They're going to be paying royalties to the knife makers. The knife makers are going to be entering these competitions. They're going to be getting awards for that. And then you've got all these new people that are going to want to start, and they're wanting to be buying some kind of lower-end beginner knife for these cutting competitions. And I can see this as a kiosk in somewhere like Bass Pro Shop, where getting your cutting competitions here, we do a little TV on top of the kiosk where they can look and show actual people cutting them. Well, so I went to, and so Jerry didn't want to do it. So I went to the ABS and asked them to support us doing it and going for a more commercial aspect to the cutting competitions. And short version to say it is the ABS declined. And so we went ahead and did it on our own. We formed the ICCT. We had some major cutters that Reggie Barker, Jimmy Crowell, John Fitch, top makers, and they started working. Daniel Winkler was in on it. Started working these competitions, and what they discovered was there was certain aspects of how to sharpen a knife and how the handle was. Reggie Barker was good at it because he was a golfer, and he said it doesn't matter how good a knife cuts if you can't hold on to it. Warren Osborne came up with a way to put the string around your thumb so it would be safer. And we started doing the cutting competitions. We did them at Smoky Mountain Knife Works for their annual thing. We did them at Shepherd Hills for their annual knife gathering. We did them at the case celebration in Bradford, Pennsylvania. We did them in, of course, with our shows, and we did them at the Bass Pro Shop on National Hunting and Fishing today. That was shown on the Outdoor Network. And at that time, we had John Fitch, who was talking to Case about them producing one of his designs. He even toured the Case factory while we were in Bradford. We had Sog talking to Reggie Barker. We had Jimmy Crowell talking to Browning. Fisk had already made basically a cutting knife with Camillus that outside what we were doing. And so then I went to the Knife Makers Guild because I was helping manage that at the time and brought them in on it. And all of a sudden we had stock removal cutters. And one of the ABS guys that were all for it, they said, and we were at a custom knife show in Arkansas, Bill Moran was there. And they said, somebody called across the room as we were talking about this cutting competition. Bill, there's no way a stock removal knife could beat a hand forged knife in a cutting competition, is there? And Bill just looked at him and said, yeah, of course. Of course there is. Depends on how they cut it, the edge geometry and their ability. Yeah, it could happen. Well, come to find out that some of the stock removal knives beat the hand forged knives. Well, the hand forged guys thought this was an abomination, not the ones that were working in the cutting competition, but the other guys. So they were resisting this like crazy because they liked the fact their little ABS thing that was going on. Well, that's ours. Why is he trying to make it bigger? So this is going great guns. And we had some fabulous pictures of people cutting these water bottles and going halfway through, and this water sprouting everywhere. It makes a fantastic picture. And Warren Osmer came up with this thing. You walk here, you do one, you got a table here, you walk here, you cut this, you do this here, you cut a ping pong ball here, you cut a 1-inch hanging rope there, then you cut water bottles at the end because that's real showy. And it was going great guns. But when I'd set this up as a corporation. And I said, what we're going to do is I'm going to control the stock until we get this thing set up and established. And then everybody can buy in. And so everybody have a piece of it that was, actively participating. So we got ready to do it. And I mailed the letter out. It's time to ante up a little money. I think it was $400, $600, something. It wasn't much. It was under $1,000. I said, here for your shares. And I get a call and a letter saying from somebody unnamed, because he's passed away now, that we don't want to participate with your stock, with your operation. We are going to do our own group. And one of our members' wives works for a lawyer, and the papers are already drawn up, and said, if you will turn this over to us, we will always acknowledge that you created it and give you the credit for it. And we will pay you back for any money you spent. Well, I'd run this as a corporation. I have a complete set of expenses, not counting, my cost of driving and things like that, but just as material and equipment we had bought to put these things on. And I told him, I said, we've got $6,000 expenses that I can document. And the guy that said this to me said, well, we don't have that kind of money. And so here I was with all of these things set up and all of these venues and all of this time spent. And I had no cutters. Some of them had already quit. Someone said, Dan Winkler quit before that, said this is just more than I'm trying to make knives. I don't need to mess with this. But some of the other guys just walked out and went over to other groups. And I was just left alone holding it. And so at one point, I eventually sold the name to them for $10. Sold my cutting table that I had produced for $2,000 or $3,000 to somebody for $400 that was interested in. And that's history, baby. As Mark Twain said, the story of a campaign that failed.
and still no attribution either.
Well, I don't know. I don't go out there and hear if they say this is a thing created by Bruce Voyles.
Yeah,
but it was.
Yeah, but not the first time that your ideas have been shit on, right? I'm reminded of what we were talking about, guild related brand ambassadors by state and everything. I thought that was something interesting that we were talking about, where you had this construct set up. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's a good idea. I thought it had a lot of validity, but it's something that died on the vine, as it were.
Well, when I was working with the guild, the first thing I did is I interviewed all of the honorary members on what the reason they went to the show. They went to a show to hang out with the makers. They saw the makers as celebrities. And then I wanted to stir up more grassroots efforts. So I thought by giving somebody a position and a title that it would spur things a little bit, particularly somebody's an active knife maker or an active knife collector who wants to get involved and help on these things. So what I told them that I wanted to do is I wanted to set up a state ambassador for each state. And I wanted the guy to be a collector and let him go around and say, like, organize 4 or 5 makers to sit together at a knife show and put a guild banner up, or just wear their state ambassador badge when they went to the gun shows and things, just as they went around, and get the flag waved out there in a lot more places. And so I found prominent collectors in a lot of states, 30 or so. And at that point, the guild board said, "No, we don't want you to do that. We want us to be handling this. We think we need to be handling this." So, and I'm still doing the promotion and advertising for the guild show. So I called back a few months later, and I asked the guy that's in charge of it, "How you doing with it?" He said, "Well, I can't find any knife makers in Rhode Island." And I just screamed. I said, "Knife makers? Merciful God under heaven. We don't need knife makers running this. We need collectors running this. This is totally for collector involvement. It's not for knife maker involvement." And at that point, that was the last I heard. I don't know if they still do it or not. I've got some friends of mine. Still see their state badges here and there when they come to a show.
Yeah, I don't. It's not something that I think that the guild actively participates in. But
Well, it's like my friend Bill Adams says. Bill Adams used to own Atlanta Cutlery. Very creative man. One of the smartest people I know. And he said, "Do you know how you tell?" He said, if you want to lead the charge, you have to get in front and blow the bugle." And the other thing he said is, "Do you know how you tell the pioneers? They're the ones with the arrows in their backs."
yeah, full stop. I mean, I think it's a lot of food for thought. Um, is you strike me as a person who just has a wellspring of good ideas and things that are really coming from a genuine love of the craft and the people who make it up. I sometimes think that the power is put in the wrong hands as far as knives go. Like a knife maker that is supposed to have their nose in their work and getting to business and producing a thing really shouldn't necessarily be the ones dictating business decisions, especially when they're not really great at business. And even further compounded to that, it's like it seems like collectively in the industry, most knife makers have some type of ego or imposter syndrome. It seems to be one of the two, where I mean, it's just the way that it is. I mean, you either have somebody who finds a reason for you not to buy their knives, or you have somebody who is like telling you all the reasons, like ice to an Eskimo, as to why you should buy it. And
Well, go ahead.
well, no, I mean, just kind of full stop. I mean, the reality is, I just don't think, maybe in the knife industry, that we should be, as makers, the only ones that dictate kind of how things go. You have to listen to the customer base, and you have to listen to people who are also passionate, but from a vantage point where they're not the ones making the knives, but they're invested in the knives because, well, they can't make them or they don't have the time to make them.
Well, if you want to make a knife, it's pretty easy now. You've got a dozen places to get taught. But the ego is an important part of it, because the time that you spend to make that knife, you're never going to regain. So the knife is a part of your being. You have this is like a child. You have created this thing, and so when you put it out there on the table, you want everybody to ooh and ah over it because it's your creation. This is your thing. This is your product. This is your time of your life created to make this thing, and it's laying out there on the table for everybody to come up and judge. So yeah, there's a lot of ego involved, and anything. A good salesman is going to sell more than somebody sits there with a scowl on their face and their arms crossed. That's just human nature. So, but there are some people. I think the way I heard it described is I call them knife worshipers. They said, okay, this is my knife. I created it, and it's a beautiful knife, and nobody makes a knife this good. And therefore, you should worship this knife. And as the creator of this artwork, you should therefore worship me. And so, yeah, there's a lot of ego involved. And some of it's just a pure artist mentality. And some of it, unfortunately, is they've read too much of their own publicity, and they start believing it. There was a church when I was one of the churches I went to in Chattanooga. The pastor decided that he would always tell a joke when he started his sermon, and everybody would laugh. They'd all tell him after the sermon that was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. So he decided that he was going to leave the church and go to Los Angeles and start speaking in comedy clubs and become a comedian, sort of like Grady Nutt was doing on Hee Haw at the time. He was going to become a Christian comedian in Los Angeles, of all places. So he loads up and goes. And one of the deacons comes up to me and said, I can't believe he did that. He said, we told him that we would always tell him that his jokes were funny, but we were just being nice. And some of these knife makers are like that too. Somebody hands you a knife, say, what do you think about this knife? Oh, it's nice. And oh, he said my knife was nice. And I know one time we're in Texas at a show in Austin, Texas, and a guy comes up and he says, tell me about this knife. Tell me about my knife. He was proud of it. Just leaving. And some of the other guys, he brought a couple of guys with him, and a couple more stood up, and he said, what can you tell me? What do you think about my knife? I want you to critique my knife. And I looked at him, did about a 10 count, and I said, are you sure you want me to do this? He said, yeah. I said, well, I'm going to be honest with you if you want to hear it. He said, yeah, go ahead. So I basically started off with, this thing is little better than a trot line weight. The steel's too hard. The handle's too rough. Why didn't you round this handle off a little bit better? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you taper this tang so it's going to have a little bit better balance? And I said, this thing's clunky. It's ugly. You've got a mirror finish. Why didn't you put a hand rubbed finish on it? I said, go over there. And I forgot who was over in the other table. You pick up that knife, because I picked it up, and it's one of those, and it was well balanced. Like a chill went up your arm. It was so well balanced. Or as Eward Oakeshoot at the Tower of London said, it woos you to strike. It was that well balanced. I said, go over and pick up that knife, and then you'll understand about balance. I can't tell you as much as I can let you hold it. Which, by the way, is one of the things that people buying and selling knives online are never going to understand what a well-balanced knife feels like as a criteria of their purchase, because they're not going to a knife show, picking it up and feeling it, and can tell the difference. And that's one of the ways you tell a genuine antique Bowie, is the ones that they made when people's lives depended upon them balanced very well. Swords the same way. So, but anyway, as I'm doing his critique, everybody's kind of looking, and they laughed and wow. And somebody said, well, you're pretty hard on him. I said, well, it's the truth. He asked me for the truth. I told him the truth. So meanwhile, somebody else goes by, and he said, yeah. I said, what did you think about that? He said, well, I agree with, yes, he was right on everything I said. But he said, that hand rub finish, I'm glad to hear that because it'll save me a lot of time from putting these knives to a mirror polish. I looked at him and says, wait a minute. You don't understand. He said, what do you mean? He says, the only way you do a decent hand rub finish is you have to bring it to a mirror polish first. And he looks and says, oh my God. Well, that guy, the last I heard, is not making knives anymore. But but the whole thing that when you get to that is if there's two or three things that you really want to sum this up with, as far as knife making. If you worry more about making your knives than you do what somebody else is doing, you're going to make a lot better knife. And as Lovelace said, make your knife any way you want to. The marketplace will sort you out soon enough.
Yeah, well said. What I don't think I've seen it anywhere, but in your Bruce on the Loose from Knife Magazine, it would be great to see an article where you go over Bruce's rules for like the knife industry and just list them out. And I mean, I would love to see that. Like, I mean, you have an entire lifetime, we're multiple lifetimes of like people in the industry to be able to culminate into those same quips that you referred to from your knife heroes and friends and things like that. I would love to see that in print.
Well, actually, I did that. And I'm not sure, it goes back several years, but it was basically along the lines of how to fail at being a knife maker, where I mentioned all of these things that I thought the knife makers were doing wrong, which is, kind of elaborating on what we've been talking about. I just summed it up in a different way is if this is how you fail at being a knife maker, you do this and you do that and you do that and you do that, and you're not going to last very long.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, maybe a little bit more cynical. I'll have to look in. We'll talk offline and see if I can find it because I'd love to be able to read that.
Okay. Well, Mark's got all of my old Mark on his website. If you join his website at Knife Magazine, you have all of his. I think he has all of those archived, so it shouldn't be a tough hunt. I might plug Mark just a minute. The Knife Magazine website is trying to be the end-all website for knife collectors. They're trying to set up an archive for knife names and these crazy guys that use their initials instead of their full name on their knives. He's archiving everything that's in print in his old books, and it's well worth the trouble.
Yeah. At some point in time, I'd like to be able to talk to Mark. We've had some conversations about it, but I actually became aware of some of the archival work through Lynn Ray, who was talking about the Bowie knife project and everything that they'd been working on for identifying dupes and other things to establish provenance for original Bowies and those that have been created in that time span. So to me, that is a benefit for all time to the knife industry, and I would not hesitate to, if I was in the position to nominate Mark in that effort, like that cadre of people into the Hall of Fame as well, because something like that happens and there's no going back. Like that is pretty much definitive to be able to reference an artist.
Well, I think he has. I'm reasonably certain he has been nominated. Ken Warner once told me, he said, well, if you stay around this business long enough, you'll eventually garner all the awards.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't surprise me. He should be inducted is like, I guess, probably the better phrase then.
Well, Ken, we put him in the Hall of Fame while he's still alive. And he, to me, was a mentor and a dear friend. And it really hurt when he passed. But he was the one that did the knives, started the Knives 81 series. He was a former editor of American Rifleman magazine. He's the one that created American Hunter magazine. And he also did Gun Digest for 15 years. We were sitting after I had sold Blade magazine, we were sitting at a banquet table with he and the people that had just bought my magazine. And they were talking. Ken and he were talking, and he had been talking to the owner of DBI Books, which owned the Knives 81 and the Gun Digest series. And he asked Ken, he said, "Why did Bruce sell Blade?" And Ken told him, said, "Well, it's every young publisher's dream to build a company and create it and then sell it." And the DBI owner looked at Ken and said, "It's every old publisher's dream too." And Ken repeated this at the banquet table to Roger Case, who had just bought Blade Magazine. Within 6 months, they bought DBI Books. And that's why you have all these Knives 2024 books. Is they bought it based on that, from that conversation.
That's incredible serendipity.
But, well, like I say, it's a small business. Everybody knows everybody for the most part. If you don't believe it, do something scandalous and everybody in the whole world's going to know it.
That's what I'm trying to do. I don't know. Scandalous is not the word. I really respect transparency. I do it in all my business practices. I've worked with lots of nefarious folk in a lot of different industry, and I always appreciate transparency, probably because it allows consumers, it allows people that you elbow with to really see you for who you are. And I think that's an important feedback loop in the human condition. Is like, you sometimes you need to be told that your knives suck. Sometimes you need to be told that you're being an asshole. Sometimes you need to correct your ways. And how are you going to do that if people are honest with you? And so transparency to me is a way that I can be above board about everything, and allow that natural process to happen without having to be told too many times that I'm doing something that I shouldn't be.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and something we've not touched on yet is the market out there. If we were talking earlier, I think before we started, that the age group of your people, that's your audience versus, say, my audience and the people that I've grown up with, it's important, particularly in the collector end of it and the knife buyer end of it, to be aware of generational changes. A few years ago, there was a quote I saw that the time was doing to the World War II vets what the Japanese and Germans could not do, which was killing them, taking them away, to the tune of about 20,000 a month. My dad was a World War II vet. He passed about that same time, so it's kind of had an impact on me. During World War II, they would take these leather washer handle K-bars and other knives into these jungle environments, and the leather handles were, and they needed to have handles for them, so they would take micarta off of the planes. The micarta was used wherever a wire or a cable was used to control the airplane. The wings and all, the flaps and all that were pulled by cables. If they went to a place where they would rub, they would put micarta underneath that as the lubricant. So they had plenty of micarta, and they had plexiglass from the airplanes. And a lot of that was getting shot through and, broken and messed up. And so and little pieces of aluminum from the airplanes as well. So they would take these and stack these up on the handles instead of those leather washers, because these were all impervious to the jungle conditions. They commonly call those theater knives. I call them heroes knives, personally. These are a distinct American knife and innovation, and they are distinctly related to a point in American history. And when these all World War II vets started passing away, I mentioned to a lot of people, you need to be looking for theater knives now, because they're going to be coming out of the woodwork. And they did, because the families were selling them, because that's just a knife Daddy carried. And they didn't recognize it was what it was. It was almost like an American art form, and it was a totally an American innovation built by necessity. And the ones you really look for are the ones that have the thin plexiglass in them, because that plexiglass came from Japanese airplanes, and they're out there. So the reason I mention this is we're having another generational change now, because the people that started collecting knives, especially vintage knives in the 70s, are now in the 1970s, early 70s, when knife collecting got started and built massive collections, are now in their 70s and 80s. And I'm getting about 3 calls a week from collectors, some who I've sold to for 30 and 40 years. And they're saying, I'm over 70 now, and my kids don't want these knives, and I need to do something with these knives. And thank God, being an auction company, we are a service for this, hope, but there's a lot of those kind of knives emerging into the market that have been in collections for 20 and 30 years. And if you ever wanted to start collecting vintage American knives, you are approaching a window here, which there's going to be plenty of them available. They're not going to be cheap, because nothing really nice is ever cheap. But I think there's going to be enough of them out there that it's going to be a very good time to be investing in high-end vintage American knives. And just to be blatant about it, if you would like to see some of those, it's jbrucevoyles.com. Just no periods, no dots, jbrucevoyles.com. And it's free to visit.
Yeah. Actually, I go to your website to look at kind of like the dives that are trending on that auction block. Anyhow, but I'm reminded. So, I at the time that I was kind of looking at trying to get into making custom knives, but more in a business sense. My stepson and I were talking to John Weaver in Glen Rose, Texas, who's 2 E's that I worked with his son. And so I didn't really get a lot of like one-on-one time with him to learn, because he was going through pancreatic cancer, survived it, and then had 2 other forms of cancer that came and was going through chemo. So he's like, I can't do this anymore. I'm touching 80. And if you want to buy the knife shop, you can do that, get all the equipment, all my, patterns and everything. And he was best friends with Martin Pullen and Clay Galt.
Oh, yeah.
And
Good people.
yeah. And so, oh yeah. And, I never got the opportunity to meet them, but I actually live every day resurrecting, especially Clay Galt's patterns, because I've found a usefulness in like the EDC crowd from knives that were previously just, renditions of scalpels and things for caping sets, sold in the Safari Club and whatnot. But the reality is that I got in touch through John and everything, a few knife makers or collectors that were collecting Clay Galt, Martin Pullen, and John Weaver knives specifically. But what they were talking to me about was not their interest in buying my knives, because I was doing something modern, my modern take and everything on something that was familiar with them pedagogy wise, right? But what they were saying, well, my kids don't need these knives anymore, and I'm like fixing to sell them. Do you know anybody who'd buy, Clay Galt or Martin Pullen knives? And so I knew, 5 years ago, especially, that this time is arising where, nobody's going to know what these guys' collections are worth. They're starting to thin them out or sell them entirely because of that. And then, it just helps them stretch a few more years in assisted living or their own lifestyles, right? And so we're getting to a place where people don't know what they have. They don't have any association with it. And I mirror what you're saying. I think that we're going to have a boom here pretty soon, where we're going to start seeing a lot of interesting knives come out of the woodwork.
Yep. Well, you mentioned Marty Pullen. He came up. We still had a non-compete, and we were talking about doing a show in Texas, in Mesquite, at Mesquite Rodeo Arena. And he came up and he said, "I hear you're thinking about doing a knife show in Texas." I said, "As soon as my non-compete's up." And I don't remember what show it was. I think it may have even been the Blade Show, and he had gotten crossways with some of the people producing the show. And they'd said something. He got his Texas up, as it said, and he handed me a business card. Said, "Well, whenever you decide to do a show, I want the first table there." And he got the first table we ever did at the Spirit of Steel show. And Clay Galt came in, and he was having health issues, and he said, "I can't stay long, and I can't really sit in those hard chairs." And so we arranged with the hotel to get him an easy chair from the lobby and put that behind his table. And he sat there as long as he could before he left. That's the last show he ever did.
You know, yeah, everything I've heard is they're great guys. In fact, when I had bought your John shop and everything, uh, Martin had, I believe, either gifted or his wife had given John some of his unfinished works. It included a few liner locks in mono steel and a broken long coffin handle buoy and a smaller Sheffield era style, right?
Yeah.
And one like what they call a Quaken now, like a Japanese style hand knife, like a Tonto, right? But American Tonto style, I guess. And John gave those to me. He said, "I don't have any use for them now. Like you know, use them for patterns or whatever." And it was actually very, very recently that I was like, I really love the Joseph Allen and Son and Joseph Rogers Sheffield era buoys, those little, working type of, kind of quasi cutlery buoys
Yeah.
with staggered jig bone handles. But I don't have, $800 to $1,400 to spend on a knife like that just to carry it around every day and feel cool. Kind of like I would want to have those things when I was a kid too. It was that or like a Rambo style buoy, right?
Yeah.
And so I took the one of that Sheffield style buoy out of this box that had Martin on it, or I think it said Poland, right? And I looked at it, I tested it, and it was 61 Rockwell hardness, so it had already been heat treated. You can even see some of the original scratch marks where Martin was trying to hand finish it. And I said, you know what? What better way to honor his memory? A man that his reputation outlasted his life, and I didn't get to meet, than to handle that up and everything. And so that's actually something that I just finished, and I thought it was I thought about him a lot. I thought about the history that I've read on him and the firsthand accounts of people that have collected his work and been friends with them, and that to me is something that I just want to do with the people in the industry, knowing that we just have our birth date and our death date, and we don't know when those the death dates things going to happen. And so my job here as a auditory archivist is to talk to people and to share their stories and their experiences and try to paint a bigger picture to just let us know how interconnected we are. So
Well, well, Dewey Ferguson called his first knife books "Romance of Collecting Knives," and I don't think that's ever really changed. It's almost like it is a romance. If you're serious about knives, and you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, it's like Louis Armstrong said about jazz. If you don't understand it, I could never explain it to you. But you just have to feel it, and knives are like that. The things over the years, what I have learned is the things I loved most about the knife business, not even necessarily the knives, although I do like them, but it was the people, and it was the interaction with these people. And, I looked up one day and I said, my best friend is in Huntington Beach, California, because we see each other at knife shows more often than we do our next door neighbors when we're living in Chattanooga, especially. And so, you know, it's this interaction and friendships and that you build within the business, and particularly with knife makers. Uh, you've got on my 40th birthday, Tommy Lee and George Heron, who are both hunting buddies of mine, presented me with a Heron Lee knife, one of the only ones they ever collaborated on. And George had done the blade, Tommy did the handle, and they had David Perdue put put a V engraved on one side and then a Roman numerals for 40 on the other. I consider that one of my most prized possessions, not because it's a knife, but it's because of the memories that are rubbed on it. And that's the way I say about knives. The ones you really appreciate the most, the ones that have memories rubbed on them. You've got, a knife that say you bought with your dad at a knife show and you still have it. And every time you look at it, you think of your dad. That's a priceless knife. It doesn't matter what the knife is because it provokes the memories. And for me, the Bowie knives, like any time that I held 1830s, 1840 Bowie knives, it's not just like you're holding a knife. If you've done the research, you're holding on to another time. And that is something you can't do in a lot of places with a lot of things. But you can, and it's like Gil Hibben used to have on his catalogs, history in your hand.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. Oh man, there's just a lot to be said about knives. And I don't know, it's just a constant endeavor for me. And it's, I know it's been that way for you too.
Well, it's like they say about New Orleans, one of my favorite towns. It says, if you love it a little bit, it'll love you back a lot.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that's probably a good bookend to this conversation.
Well, now let me throw in there Bill Adams's contrary opinion on that.
What?
Said, if you love your knives, do they love you back?
Yeah. Well, in knives, it's all about juxtaposition, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, I feel like there's a lot more that can be said. I could talk to you for hours, and if you ever want an adopted son, I'll be more than happy to elect myself for it. I really, I like you a lot. But
Well, thank you.
it's a I think that it almost goes without saying, and I've said it a few times here, but thank you. Thank you for contributing your life energy to this craft and to make it for dipshits like me to be able to even have this platform. It's because of people like you, and it is because of you. That is such a profound observation to me. I think about it a lot, and the very least I could do is pay homage to your influence. I hope that we have many more conversations that we can record and talk about on this podcast. But if that ever doesn't become a thing, at least I'll take the time to say it now. That thank you for all that you've done and all that you're doing.
Well, it's nice to know that what you do is appreciated. Since you mentioned adopted, I've got to tell you one quick story before I go. I was at the ABS when they inducted me in the ABS Hall of Fame. I was there, and Bill and Margaret Moran, Bill and Margaret Moran came up to speak, and Margaret, my wife, was always best friend. She basically was an adopted daughter of Margaret, and they said, "Did your parents come? We'd like to meet them." And I said, "No, ma'am, they didn't." And Margaret said, "Well, Bill and I will be your parents today." I said, "That would be ideal." So I can proudly proclaim, it would have been his 99th birthday this week, actually. Can proudly proclaim that I was once adopted, even if only for a day, by W.F. Moran and Margaret. And I consider that one of the finest moments in my life. And it's a story that I love to tell. And it's just like, as a writer, the ultimate compliment to a writer is somebody read what you write. And as a writer too, that's all you can ever ask for, is to read what you write. And if you're doing stuff in knives, it's for somebody to understand what you're doing and why you did it, at least to give you a little bit of appreciation. So I do appreciate that, and I've got to where anymore. Some people come up and they say, "Well, I enjoy your column in Knife Magazine. I read it every time." I said, "Fine. If you, do you like my writing?" "Oh, I love your writing." Well, I've got 3 novels here. Would you like to look at those?" Two of them are about a guy who's a knife dealer, and then you hit them with the price, and well, I find out that they don't like my writing quite that much, but some do. And if anybody's interested, you can read excerpts on it on Amazon. The books are The Carroll Factor, The Vengeance Creek, and the third book is Storyville Sirens, so a novel about New Orleans in the Storyville days. The books are not listed under Bruce Voyles. They are listed under J.J. Bruce. The reason is my mama, who was a walker, married a Voyles. And she always told the children, my daughters, marry up the alphabet. Because if they do things in alphabetical order and you're a Voyles or a Walker, you're always in the back of the room. So one of my daughters married a Bradford and the other married a Moore, so they accomplished their goals. So when I started to find a pen name for my novels, I figured J.J. Bruce would be working for J. Bruce Voyles.
Everything with a purpose and an intent, and I love that about you.
Well, read the novels first. I enjoyed writing them, and it may be the last three. I don't know that I'm ever going to do another one, and but I'm still going to be doing things in Knife Magazine. Matter of fact, I'm sitting at home today trying to figure out what on earth am I going to write about this.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'll definitely.
But generally, somebody's going to aggravate me, and I'll come up with something.
Yeah, the greatest honor is to be immortalized in somebody's random rant and publication, right?
Well, the beauty of my column is when I first started it, Mark gave me the freedom to write whatever I wanted. And a couple of times he said, you're POing a lot of these old guys when you talk about some of this stuff. I said, well, it was the truth. And you said I could write about anything I wanted to. So he said, yeah, I did, didn't I? And that's the end of it.
Yeah, my wife says like just because it's the truth doesn't mean you have to be an asshole about it.
But I was thinking the other day though, is I started writing columns in publications about knives in 1975, and I wrote a column in every issue of Blade and every issue of Knives Illustrated, and a bunch of them in National Knife Collector magazine. The reason was my old editor, not my boss that I was telling you about earlier, but my old editor who was a World War II vet, China-Burma India Theater, and a true newspaper man. He had everything except the green visor and the garters on his arms to keep out of the ink. And he said that if you couldn't write an editorial once a week in a weekly newspaper, you weren't doing your job. And so every time there's a publication come out, I'm trying to make sure I've got a column for that very reason. So just kind of stuff sticks with you. Well, I enjoyed talking to you too. Come up with questions or something, just holler. Good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you taking the time and talking to my me and my listeners to be able to hear it. It's an amazing honor.
Well, as I said earlier, I hate to disappoint you on that, but I appreciate the fact that you're talking. So.
Well, thank you very much. I really do mean that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.